Intros though first. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure. Why are we here, Sam?
Why are we here? Hello everyone, tuning into this conversation here. We're going to be today talking about Anduin. We're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into both Anduin's history in World of Warcraft, his writing, our issues with his writing, what we like about his writing, basically a pretty comprehensive deep dive into his character. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Ash, but can call me Sam, also known as Claret Ash 11 on Twitter, and basically I have an interest in Anduin's sort of writing as it corresponds to Rathian's as well, and he's one of my favourite characters. He's generally one of my long-standing favourite characters of World of Warcraft. He was one of the characters that got me into being more interested in the world and the lore within Mr. Pandaria. So a character who, like, in my formative years of playing WoW, so I was just in the sort of height of me being very serious about playing WoW, and I just had a quick break after Cat, and I was wanting to come back into Mr. Pandaria. I feel like Anduin was definitely the character who wrote me back into this game. So there is my sort of standpoint, and my sort of background is that I'm an artist, but I'm also a professional arguer by trade. I have a general interest in Warcraft lore. I try and keep up with all the general details. I guess supposedly my specific talents is sort of breakdowns in narrative construction, character building, all formulated from my background in writing and my current work in writing in a way. And essentially just stories, and in particularly gaming stories and things like that, and just how those all interlock. So, hey everyone. Okay, who wants to introduce themselves next? Who's next on the chopping block here?
Porter, do you want to go next?
Sure. I am Portergauge. I also go by Porter. You might know me as Portergauge on Twitter, or just as a random gnome in game. I, if you didn't know, am a very big World of Warcraft lore fan. I have been playing the game since it started, and I have been very into the lore since about Wrath of the Lich King. And my particular love of Anduin very much comes from Mr. Pandaria, and how I very literally grew up with him. We are about the same age at every point, and I don't know what else to say. You had a lot more stuff to talk about yourself with, but...
No, that was perfect. You don't have to say any more if you don't want to.
I'm just a chat box, as people well known before now. And Paul is very, very highly regarded in regards to his opinions about Warcraft lore on Twitter, as people know. The social medias.
Yeah, I have a massive repository of mostly useless World of Warcraft knowledge in my head. I can tell you pretty much every retcon, every little change in story that's ever happened with most characters.
There we go. And finally, Syl, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I go by Sylvanas. I have been playing World of Warcraft since Legion. I kind of fell in love with the story around patch 8.3 when Visions of N'Zoth dropped. I got interested in Anduin. I was actually interested in Rathian first. I kind of got into his character during the pre-patch, which I talk about way too much because I love it so much, which has Rathian's journals in it. And then the cinematic dropped with him and Anduin, and I was like, oh, what's going on here? And that's kind of when I started to get into Anduin's character. I got into writing fanfic for him. That was kind of when I really started to fall in love with this character. I just was really compelled by this gentle peacemaker. I thought he was a really unique character in this very macho war-based game. I thought there was something like very special and kind of beautiful about him. So that's kind of what got me interested in him.
Hell yeah, may I just say, welcome everyone. What we're going to be doing here today is just covering some major points about Anduin. We're going to be talking about both his history within the game and dissecting basically his story so far, both within its writing and its themes, and the things that we draw issue with, to really get to the meat of the matter about the things that haven't worked so well for Anduin over the years. His potential, his delivery, and the state that he finds himself currently within Warcraft's narrative. Talk about the things that we like too, we're not forgetting those, and also what we'd like to see, less so saying what the devs need to do, but mostly in regards to what we'd like to see from this character. As three people who are quite intense fans of this character and having our experiences with World of Warcraft be deeply affected by this character, and what we do hope and what we do believe will be a very satisfying way to both start the World Soul Saga and essentially what we might hope to see from that. Right, okay, the first bit. Would we like to talk about the short story? We're recording this off the back of the announcement of the short story, which will be included in the anthology of, I think it's The Voices Within?
Yes.
Which will be supposedly published in November.
Which, interestingly, will be after the expansion launch.
Yes, if all goes time-wise to plan, we're looking at approximately a expansion launch. Personally, from my guess, it's going to be around the August-September period. Who knows though? We're going to tackle this on the basis that this book is going to be published after the expansion comes out. Now, first of all, guys, do we think that's actually true? Do we believe that these short stories are going to be published online individually leading up to the expansion, and this will be basically the amalgamation of them that's published in a book? So, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I personally have my doubts, just because they're doing a similar short story thing in Overwatch. Of like, here's all the characters we haven't focused on. Here's the characters who will be relevant for our next bit of the story. And it's coming out in actually a week. And none of those have been published online. They are solely in that book.
Now, I would say, comparing and contrasting here, Overwatch's stories are very self-contained. Like you were saying, Port, Overwatch's stories are very essentially character-focused between character interactions rather than an overarching narrative. From the blurb alone, these are definitely introspective moments set to precede World of Warcraft's highly anticipated The War Within expansion. That's a mouthful, by the way. This is just my minor criticism, not related to Anduin. World of Warcraft, The War Within.
Oh no. Sam? While we're waiting for Sam to come back, did you have any thoughts about the short story?
Right now, I think I am mostly just sitting in the wait and see kind of category, because it very much feels like, I don't want to say fluff, but ultimately more just a catching up point for some people on some of his trauma stuff, leading into what we saw in the War Within cinematic, where he's still dealing with this stuff, he is not having it resolved in any way, but he is still resolving himself to help people anyways. So I do think it's just going to be kind of a on his way between what we heard in 10.2.5 from Matthias Shaw and what we see in the expansion cinematic, of just somewhere on his way to that point. He's going to have some kind of bad experience that's going to reaffirm his fears about himself.
I had like a different thought. I thought that it was probably going to be him doing something heroic. I would like it to be something where he kind of like him going through an experience that kind of reinforces the doubts he has about himself. But from the description, I was kind of thinking maybe it would be possibly him, you know, rescuing a family or a village from like a fire, that kind of thing, where he does like a heroic deed and then inks a bit. And then that sets the tone of like where he's going to be when the War Within starts.
I have pretty much no expectations as the actual plot, because it's a very vague description compared to the other three. The other three have much more like, here is the thing that is happening in the story, and not just Anduin will be emotional, which is fairly expected for Anduin anytime he shows up. Yeah, I am in more of the neutral ground of, I do not have a lot of thoughts on the story. I am mostly just hoping it will be good.
Yeah, same here. I really like the way he was written in Shadows Rising, so I keep hoping for a return to that, but I'm not quite sure if that's going to happen in this short story.
Yeah, it's one of those lines to ride between Anduin's flaws being him acting out of logical self-doubt and self-anguish about what he has failed to do, and doing things that are actually somewhat questionable from a point that makes sense for his character, like what Shadows Rising did, versus a lot of the times where his flaws and the things that make him heartbreaking is just that he is too sad about things. and he is just too good for the evil around him, and that breaks his heart.
He's too good for this world, that kind of attitude about him.
Hopefully it leans on the former, because I would very much like this to set the tone for Anduin showcasing his flaws at the start of this, what is supposedly a 3 expansion arc.
Right. I think it's going to be very hard to deal with him as a main character if he doesn't have some kind of struggle with some kind of flaw. It's going to get really old really quickly.
Or in particular, if it is just kind of his flaw is getting flashbacks to being dominated and then accidentally lashing out.
My son.
While that is definitely a very realistic flaw, that is a very realistic aspect of PTSD, it is not something that you can really say, this character is flawed, it is just this character is hurt. It would be much more interesting for me if his experiences being on the bad team almost polarize his morality. He has always had this very interesting, everyone can be redeemed kind of mentality, aside from a few moments in certain books, where he has always had this, everyone can be fundamentally good, that in his mind, there is fundamental evil and fundamental good, but that everyone has the capacity to do both if they put in effort. And it will be interesting to see how, in his own warped view, he has shown his capacity for evil.
They believe my hands are clean, but they don't feel clean. It was so horrific and exhilarating. And it sickens me to think that satisfaction may have been mine.
And he has shown in some ways that maybe he thinks he's a hypocrite now. Maybe he thinks that those views of his aren't something he can uphold when he as a person has fallen so low. Because up until now, he has never been on that side of the coin. He has always been on the side of, I'm good and I know everyone else can be good like me, because in a lot of ways he has been somewhat informed by his lack of experiences, by his lack of personal darkness to overcome. And so now that he does have that relatively, I don't want to say late into his life, but late into his story.
You fear you might not be who you thought you were.
I'm starting to wonder if I ever knew. For the first time in my life, I'm afraid that if I call on the light, it won't answer.
How does that kind of change how he views the world and views himself? And how will that tie into these kind of forces of, on the surface, light and darkness that might not be as polarizing good and evil? Like the Arathi, like the Nerubians, like Xalatath.
Up until this point, I feel like you could look at some of the things that he's done, like during the fourth war, and kind of from like a meta perspective look at the story and say, oh, Anduin is doing these bad things. He's like sending, well, they didn't say whether they actually got to sending farmers out to war.
That's the last of the soldiers. We'll be calling up farmers next.
But him making like bad decisions as like a king, like him doing concretely bad things versus him being passively tortured.
There's a lot of lack of agency, intentional or otherwise, in his time as king, where a lot of the harsh realities of war are very much put as just harsh realities the Alliance must go through and he must suffer through nobly.
When this war began, I thought we were fighting for peace. But we're just fighting.
You're doing all you can to stop her, Your Majesty.
Whereas on the inverse, the harsh realities of war and the Horde were very much pinned on specific characters and pinned as their specific moral flaws.
Only innocents remain in the tree. This is war. No. This is hatred. Rage.
Hi everyone, I'm back.
Welcome back.
What have we been discussing?
We were just continuing to discuss the short story and what we might expect in terms of where Anduin goes as a character, like where this might take place in his journey. Because as I said, this is, as it seems, before the War Within cinematic, where he is very clearly still grappling with his self-doubt, still grappling with his PTSD, but ultimately resolving the fight. So I don't think this is going to be a story with a happy ending. This is probably going to be the kind of story that reaffirms his self-doubts going into the expansion. And we were just kind of thinking about, in what ways will it do that? Will it do it in the self-doubt of him suffering nobly, self-doubt of him just having this instinctual PTSD, which, while realistic, isn't really something you can blame him for. It's not something you can really call a flaw, versus having him actually go through the process of re-examining his own philosophy about good and evil, about people's capacity to change, to do good no matter what. Now that he has experienced being on the bad guy team, now that he might see himself as a hypocrite for that, because how can he espouse that doing what he did?
I'm not that person anymore! Not after what I've done!
I really, really like that. And I think that is my hopes for it too. The best way to handle that short story would be for Anduin to have self-reflection. And not only that, but see that often his actions of, I'm doing good, right, aren't always perceived as that. That is fine, but also then following up with that, because we actually do get that a lot from Anduin, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
In his case, the road from hell.
The road from hell in this case. Perfectly put. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. But the thing is that after a while, you need to obviously perceive your own behavior and how your relationships with other people and how you handle yourself around other people and how you interact with other people has these effects, because once or twice can be forgiven. But if this keeps on happening, one needs to look inwards in your own actions. And I think that's an issue with Anduin, that especially from that blurb alone, again, it sounds like what we have had a major issue about with Anduin. Things happen to Anduin, and Anduin suffers through them. And once again, it's the cruelty of others and how their thoughtless actions, despite Anduin's best efforts, lead us all down a worse path.
Only one of us wanted this war.
You're doing all you can to stop her.
One thing that did kind of remind me about is in that blurb, it does mention that he is seeking solitude. And obviously, he doesn't quite do that when we next see him in the War Within cinematic. He is alone, but he is in a place that is very obvious and easy to find right in front of the biggest landmark on Azeroth.
That sword was aimed at someone.
Going out on a very wild tangent as a possible theory, I do almost wonder if this is supposed to be a very heartrending, very dark start to what should be a large-scale arc over multiple expansions. I do almost wonder if this is going to be kind of his own Edge of Night, where it is putting to rest the Anduin that came before, the perfect, always on the side of good, always being the one that people uphold themselves to.
Stand as one for the Alliance!
And having him, through whatever trouble he meets in this, get a moment of, maybe I can't be alone, but I can just get out of it some way.
He witnesses perhaps cruelties upon others and instead of acting, leaves them to their fates. I can't help these people, and every time I try and help, bad shit happens, so I rather just leave them to their fates.
And then he grapples with the guilt of that afterwards, perhaps. And that's where the short story leads into, be it a more positive note of, okay, maybe I should actually start helping, or of a, maybe I should just throw myself at the problem, do what good I can until I expire kind of moment.
I think those are pretty much a reasonable basis. I think that's probably the best that we can engage with the story on this behalf here.
It is very interesting how vague this one is compared to the other three. Like when you look at the other three, it is very clear, okay, Illyria is going to have some kind of story with her son, with Eretor. A very clear thing. Durak is basically going to have his Anduin moment. Thrall is going to have his Varian moment of, I need to let my son be his own person, and I need to find out who I am. And that's going to lead into where we find him in the cinematic. And then Gazlowe is probably unsettled setup for a patch story with goblins. Whereas with Anduin's, it mostly just touches on what we already know in that he is alone, and then touched on the fact that there will be sad emotions in this.
Yes, that's one thing I don't actually like about Blizzard's writing, and it's a continuous thorn in my side, is when the devs or stories tell us, this will be emotional, you will cry. I do not cry like that.
Like we've talked about in the past, I think that's all kind of come from that one unfortunate moment with Ysera's death. And how they've kind of been trying to chase that high since then to middling success.
There is no better cue for knowing that you're not going to be emotionally affected when someone says you will be emotionally affected by this. I'm like, all right. In a tone, I'm like, all right. I'm just preparing all the devs here. I will probably not cry. However, I'll be pleasantly surprised on the day that something really does get to me emotionally. I feel like my most emotional things were probably from Mr. Pandaria and things like that. And therein in Anduin's relationship, when it wasn't so much just Anduin going, I miss my father. My father had such a huge impact on my life. Varying this, varying that. Instead, understanding their differences, and even though they had a very tense relationship, still being able to respect and love Varian in his own way rather than just a classic way. I think that's what we can hope for the best for from this short story. Just compounding on that again, our fears is just bad things happen to Anduin. Anduin feels sad. Anduin decides that I better isolate myself more just in case I cause more hurt to other people. Not great, because again, much like many of Anduin's stories since Mr. Pandaria, it is expunged the sense of responsibility from Anduin in a lot of his stories. Anduin tried his best. He can't help it that other people act like this.
Only one of us wanted this war.
It's really just a big series of a pat on the back. Get him next time, champ.
You're doing all you can to stop her.
Yeah, you're always trying so hard, and people often argue oh well, you can't say that Anduin is the favorite of the narrative, perfect person in the narrative, and we're just being overcritical of this. Anduin is very much set up to be, and we'll discuss this a bit more later in another point, very much to be the moral center of World of Warcraft, that people had better agree with him, and if you're in opposition to Anduin, you're considered in the wrong perspective. And again, with this short story, if things don't align perfectly to what Anduin's beliefs are, he seeks out peace, or he's trying to find solitude, and he'll try and help out where he can, but if people's cruelties around him, he can only help so much, and he feels bad now.
That is a worry of mine in general. We were talking about this a lot later, of the idea that Anduin seeking to be alone, to just be Anduin, to be his own person, is a bad thing because he has a higher calling of some sort.
The world needs your light again.
I do worry that it might be the seeds of setting up that for the future of his eventual return of the king, you might say.
By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand! Men of the West!
Return of the King. Oh, do I have some words to say about Lord of the Rings too, and that tried, possibly, my worries for the future in trying to incorporate, in the most nebulous sense, a story like Lord of the Rings in regards to Anduin's own story.
It's going to be interesting to touch on that. The difference is between a story that is intentionally uncritical of monarchy.
Now come the days of the king. May they be blessed.
Versus a story like WoW that does address flaws of monarchy and how you frame a king, frame a leader in those perspectives.
Exactly. And the other thing to mainly remember about that is Lord of the Rings, in its own right, with all the criticisms of Lord of the Rings and also the glowing positivity around Lord of the Rings traditionally follows a reverse hero's story, but also it has an air to it that reads almost like a fairy tale. It's a lot more intense, obviously, than a fairy tale, but Tolkien always showed his love in regards to classic stories, almost Arthurian legends.
This day does not belong to one man, but to all
Let us together rebuild this world.
Now that's good from a narrative perspective, but I don't think it's a very good application to a modern day MMO where war crimes are going on.
Only innocents remain in the tree.
Like, certainly battles are fought within Lord of the Rings, but there's a certain level of romantic Arthurian removal in their battles.
In the words of the similarly controversial George R. R. Martin, we never hear about Aragorn's tax policy. We never hear about Aragorn's plans for the rest of the orcs who fled into the mountains, because it's ultimately not a story about those realistic things. It is not a story about how a king might lead a kingdom in the wake of this story. It is a story about good and evil, and his status as king is symbolic of the triumph of good.
My friends.
You bow to no one.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is the major way to contrast and differentiate those sorts of stories, and how that idea can't be applied to WoW because of the story that's already been set up in WoW, and how that story can't be applied when you have a interactive story of people playing this game. If you wanted a very almost disorientating a fantasy that reads like a fairy tale / like I said, romantic Arthurian legends with a very clear-cut moral in it. Like you said, the victory of good over evil, and having very clear themes of like free will and death and things like that, but done almost in a way this isn't belying the complexity of Lord of the Rings, but it is delivered in a very simple way in regards to the scope of its story and the scope of its narrative within an actual written story. WoW doesn't have those allowances, and I think that's the important thing to remember, especially if they want a younger audience to engage with WoW and its own fans that already exist. You need to forge your own path in regards to storytelling there, and you can't just supplement like, well, the fellowship all traveled together, right? We can do that too. And it's like, that has been done in MMOs before, but quite differently, having a friend group and things like that. You shouldn't use Lord of the Rings as an example of that, because even with, for example, Legolas and Gimli's conflicts and things like that, the depth and complexity of the emotions of the people in that group was written for a story like Lord of the Rings, as in it's very simplified.
It ultimately is a very simple, bigotry is bad, two people of differing groups coming together is good. It ends with that positive message. There isn't a lot of complexity to it because the circumstances are intentionally simple.
I know that people be like, Lord of the Rings isn't simple. And like I said, the things that Tolkien loved were language building. And also, dare I say, he loved world building in a sense that didn't touch on world politics. He liked maps, and he liked locations, and he liked the idea of a realm beyond our own.
One by one, the free lands of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring. But there were some who resisted.
Less so actually world building as to who was trading with each other and like what sort of things did that. It was a very fantasy level sort of world building.
It's a very broad, complex world, but a very obvious, simple theme.
For example, even though I'm not even the biggest fans of George R. R. Martin's books, I know his are a lot more complex in like setting up world building.
20,000 men, is it?
Yes, Your Grace. A few died in transit.
They weren't good fighters, you won't miss them.
Horses?
2,000.
And elephants?
No elephants, Your Grace.
That's disappointing. I was told the Golden Company had elephants.
They are excellent beasts, Your Grace, but not well suited to long sea voyages.
And like authors like Robin Hobb and people like that, other fantasy legends and stuff. Even people who wrote, you know, teen fantasy books for like when I was younger, like a Tamora Pierce and stuff like that. World building has grown a lot more in the years coming from Tolkien, essentially. Tolkien world built in his ability with languages, while, you know, other things have developed from there. Anyway, getting back onto the Anduin connection here.
Good segue of talking about like the origins and the origins of monarchy is probably the origin of Anduin in the story.
There we go. And I think now what we might do is touch on the history of Anduin too. And Sil, do you have any extra points though, just finishing up in regards to your hopes in regards to the short story? And then if not, we will go on to the history of Anduin.
I don't really think I have much to say about the short story. I don't really have any expectations for it. I just hope it's a little more than Anduin is sad again, because Anduin has been sad since Legion.
Since this war with the Legion began, I've barely had a chance to think, or breathe, or to mourn. Perhaps it's time to change that. I cannot do this, Father. I know firsthand the pain of loss.
And I think he needs to have more emotions and more things.
My father is dead because of—
More stuff to chew on. Like, Angst is good, Angst is very enjoyable, and that's definitely a part of his character I enjoy.
What is real if our perceptions cannot be trusted? Anduin!
But it has to kind of be earned in some way, and I feel like we haven't had as much of the meat of like Anduin as a character to kind of like enjoy the dessert of Angst. So we've kind of just had like all dessert, and it's just like getting a little much right now.
A little bit sickening.
I have a sweet tooth on Anduin Angst.
My father is dead!
It's pretty bad.
Like we were just saying too, that connects very strongly. People can say, well, you know, you can't say Anduin is the favourite of the narrative when he's always so sad and he suffers so much. He's been riding on the same level of suffering for the last 4 expansions about Varian being dead.
My father is—
And as awful as that sounds, me just going, oh, get over your dead fucking fart, excuse my language.
Life is pain, Highness.
But the thing is that, like, it is very much ridden on this. And like you said, you can't substitute angst and feeling sad about things as to make a good character. And this is the thing, if they want to discuss this in War Within, which might be interesting, the PTSD of Anduin, but also the idea of like not letting it fall into that trap again of Anduin is sad because all these awful things have happened to him. Make it so that Anduin has done things that have harmed himself in regards to his own actions with little care of who other people he hurts as well. And I think that last section will always be the bit that the writers tend to try and avoid. They'll be like, see, Anduin's hurting himself, he's isolating himself, he's taking it all upon himself. And I'm like, okay, but how does that interact with the other characters here? Because Anduin can't subsist in his own little bubble of feeling sad and sorry and awful things happening to him. They will get to a point where Anduin will start hurting other people because of the actions that he takes, and whether that's abandoning people who are in need, avoiding people he cares about, pushing people away that he cares about, making bad decisions from that, are all good points to bring him back into line, make him human, make him selfish in regards to his need to isolate or to navel gaze for this long, or just make it that, you know, he comes to terms that he's not a great leader too, which actually takes then the air quotes people he's abandoning of Stormwind. How do they feel about that? And is this a selfish choice, or is this like a choice that will have, obviously it would be a choice that has much further ramifications, but again, it can't just be things happen to Anduin. Anduin's suffering because of all the bad, because at the moment that's where we're at, basically coming out of Shadowlands 100% is Anduin feels sad because of all the things that have happened to him, but none of them are his fault.
My friends, the ones I almost killed, they believe my hands are clean.
So, how did we get to this point? Let's start on that. The history of Anduin. Port, would you like to start us off on like the major points of Anduin's journey throughout WoW?
Do we want to start chronologically within the universe or from our perspective as players witnessing the story?
Let's go chronologically from the player's perspective, because I feel like that would be the more telling, because we all know that Anduin's existed from vanilla. His greater inclusion in the the story was due to Christy Golden's insistence that he'd make for a good character. I feel that when Anduin started becoming a character of notoriety was that sort of end of Cataclysm leading into Mr. Pandaria. So maybe that would be a good place to start, especially because we're recording this before Pandemonium comes out later this year and any possible announcements about that. But yeah, I think that'd be a good place to start if you'd like to start us off there.
We can do a recap before that. Everyone knows Anduin was the King of Stormwind in-game, little 10-year-old boy model. He was kind of the placeholder because they were doing stories with Varian in the comics. And then we later did get some stories with Anduin in those comics, but he was largely just Varian's nice son who got used as a plot point to motivate him and not so much his own character.
The good little sweet boy that Varian, despite all of his chaos so far, was one good thing in his life.
As you said, Chris Metzen had no real plans for him. He was mostly just, he was there to be the son of Varian. He was there to be just a point of world building for the character of Varian, which he was very much fond of, we shall say. It wasn't really until the Shattering where suddenly he became an actual character, where suddenly he had a very interesting counter story to Varian's, where Varian was going down the path of warmongering, and Anduin very suddenly rose as this idea of peace, which up until now, that was only really held by Jaina. Jaina was really kind of the one voice in a world where everyone else, even Thrall, who she considered a friend, was willing to go to war to protect the people. They were willing to use war as a first resort, where to a character like Jaina and a character now like Anduin, that was not even a last resort, that was not a resort at all. They were not willing to do that. And so the first place he really shows up, I would say, is the Twilight Highlands story in Cataclysm, where that is the origins of the Anduin we see in Mists of Pandaria. The Anduin that he gets tired of being bound to the throne, being bound to the throne room, and he sneaks out with the player under the guise of an official thing for his father to go investigate the Twilight's Hammer cults. He goes to try and figure out what's wrong in his city to get things done, not as a prince, not as the son of the king, but as a priest trying to do good. Because before this, we'd also seen stories like Velen's short story, where he got the grand magical vision of Anduin in the future, which has a lot of other implications, especially for the War Within. And it was also stuff like Wolfheart, where we first saw the rift between their characters, where Varian accidentally assaults Anduin, where Varian accidentally hurts him, and that very much sets the rift between them. That sets it beyond just a difference in ideology, but actually a difference in their relationship where they had animosity towards each other.
Yeah, and actually just cutting in on that bit too. A lot of people like to dismiss Wolfheart as not like, oh, you know, don't think of that as Varian's character. Personally, I actually like that. Not in a sense of assaulting children,
but in the sense of him being a flawed character.
I'm always a very fond person of the idea that you can have a lot of difficulties with a parent and you can not exactly love them in a way that's unconditional, especially a child towards a parent. It can definitely be a conditional love depending on how a parent treats you. And I actually don't mind that. I don't mind the idea of Anduin having a very difficult and complex feeling towards Varian, because the thing is that people could say that Varian didn't mean it. It was an accident. And as someone who's worked in basically child protection and things like that, that isn't really an excuse. So you can't really be like, well, I didn't mean to break my child's arm. It was an accident. Yes, but you did grab them. You did lay hands on your own child. And Varian knows his own strength. Saying that Varian doesn't know his own strength would be incredibly silly. Varian knows his own strength, and he still grabbed Anduin that hard and caused him that harm. And allowing Anduin then to have difficult and complex feelings towards Varian that are never really resolved even after Varian's death. Like, he can still love his father despite all of that. He can still respect his father. But allowing Anduin to have difficult or complex feelings towards Varian is okay. You don't have to unconditionally love a parent. That's the thing. And I think that the WoW writers often shy away from that. It's either the parent is good or the parent is evil. I'm thinking of Jaina's parents.
That does tie very interestingly into Anduin's other final plot point in Cataclysm before he moved to Mists of Pandaria, which was Varian's short story, The Blood of Our Fathers, where Varian dies, like flat out dies. fighting off Twilight cultists. And it was after Wolfheart that Anduin made the choice to go train with Velen, to go become a priest. It was that moment. It was, in a sense, the animosity with his father that made him find his faith. And it was that very same faith that later allowed him to bring his father back to life. And it was one of those interesting moments of complexity where even with that animosity, even with that distancing to go train, his faith was still ultimately what brought his father back. It was that desperate prayer that brought him back.
I like that. Again, the relationship between a child and a parent doesn't need to be clear cut. People may say, well, you know, the relationship between Jaina and her mother is complex. And I'd actually argue that it isn't actually all that complex. It was based on Jaina's mother still loved her rather unconditionally, but she had to abide by like what she thought the rules that Jaina had broken, things like that. Having a very difficult and complex relationship between a child and a parent in WoW is a rarity, I'd actually say. I feel like they're quite often very clear cut. For example, Gen's filing down of his rougher traits. What's the word I'm looking for here? Accordingly, known racist Gen Greymane has lost those traits over time with his relationship with Tess, because having a parent who may be racist or not be cool, they've sort of watered that down to be like, Gen's just in the past, and that's sad.
The world is changing, Tess. And as much as I try, I find it hard to change with it.
But he knows that Tess is all well and good.
But you have proven yourself 1,000 times over, my girl. And this kingdom now belongs to you.
But we're not going to actually touch on what that past is, because we're not going to touch on the socio-political elements of building a wall and isolating yourself from other kingdoms, and the political ramifications of soldiers and self-interest and political intrigue. It was mostly just he's in the past and he's emotionally hurt on the inside, and that's why he put up a wall.
I see you, Father. Always hiding from your pain. It's why you built that wall in the first place.
It's the metaphor of it, not the whole issue with the Scourge. And like you said, Port, just like actual history in regards to Gilneas. No. It's all a metaphor about Gen putting up walls, of course. Also, Sil, I interrupted you before. Your thoughts about Anduin's relationship with Varian here.
I was just going to say that I really, really love that their father-son relationship was so flawed early on, and that it basically went on this arc to culminate in the Son of the Wolf comic, where Anduin gets that letter posthumously after Varian's death.
My son, a terrible darkness has returned to our world. As before, it seeks to annihilate everything that we hold dear. I go to face it, knowing I may not return.
So they go from Varian being just like a very broken parent. He had all this suffering. He has his own internal turmoil. He can't control his temper or his rage to the point where he loses control of himself and he actually breaks his son's arm. And then Anduin makes the decision to go away and see Velen as like a surrogate father figure almost, and a teacher. So like they start there, and then their relationship gradually heals and they get to understand each other. And then it kind of culminates with Varian actually admitting to Anduin that, I see your point of view now. I think your pursuit of peace is noble.
Anduin, I now believe, as you do, that peace is the noblest aspiration.
I think that's really compelling, and I feel like that moment in Wolfheart especially is just like really important. I don't mind that it gets like that dark.
Sometimes characters do need a darkest point, a lowest moment, in order to start the arc towards improvement. And that very much was Varian.
Exactly. So that was all I wanted to say, is that I personally really love that moment in Wolfheart. I love that that was the beginning of Anduin's path. Well, actually, was Wolfheart, did that come after the Shattering, or was that before?
It did come after the Shattering, yes. I don't believe Anduin was fully a priest in the Shattering yet. He showed connections to it, as far as I'm aware, but it was more like hints with Fearbreaker that showed his connection to the light, and not necessarily him actually being trained yet.
Yeah, and this is what I mean about kind of like earning your moments. Like, I feel like that moment where in Varian's letter, his death and that letter and the Legion trailer and all that, like, I feel like that is made all the more powerful and impactful because their relationship started there early on in the story.
It's been difficult for me to trust after losing so much. But from you, I have learned patience, tolerance, and faith.
It's one of those interesting ideas of, like, they came to a happy medium, and the story with Anduin, at least at that point, seemed more like it was going into living up to the legacy rather than the ideals of Varian.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. Like, the legacy of Varian being at least, like you said, not holding his ideals, because even, with all of his progress in Pandaria and things like that, he was still a more warlike leader, even though he basically reconciled with not only just Anduin as a person, but Anduin's own held beliefs. Varian believed that Anduin made him a better person for considering that.
It is one of those interesting things where they did have more planned with that, where one of the common critiques of Varian's arc is that he goes from those moments in Wolfheart, those moments in his short stories of being very warmongering, very aggressive, very hard to control his emotions, to what we see in Mists of Pandaria during the Landfall patch, where he is very confident in peace, where he is very confident in his son's ideologies. We never necessarily saw a lot of the transition there because they originally were planning what was called the Trials of the High King, where he would basically go through a scenario with each of the Alliance racial leaders and learn a lesson from them, be it a lesson on leadership, a lesson on peace, a lesson on how to work with others, and kind of earn his title of High King. He already was High King at the end of Wolfheart, but he needed to kind of earn the idea of actually being that leader and worthy of that title. But unfortunately, the first one we got was A Little Patience featuring Tyrande Whisperwind, which fumbled the message a bit by having Tyrande learn from Varian instead, despite being the 10,000-year-old general. And then we did get one more. We got one more with Moira, which I thought was better than that, in that he did learn from Moira, in some ways, those ideas of working despite not having cooperation, of working towards the better path, despite having people distrust you. But I do think largely the reaction to the Tyrande story caused them to kind of can that and just kind of have us assume he went through that arc.
I suppose that's another one of our brute critiques of Blizzard writing. The shyness of writers once they have criticism on a story, rather than try and digest the critique, they tend to shy away from then approaching it again, which isn't great. As tough as sometimes a lot of our criticisms can be, both as us three here and also the wider WoW community, the people who are actually fully engaged with lore and they are providing sometimes rather harsh critiques. The idea that devs often shy away from that, and I think that's a part of like writing though. Sometimes critiques can be harsh, but you can learn a lot from that. The worst thing you can do is shy away from it and never want to approach it again. And I think that is probably, like you said, Varian's story suffered there because from one tiny failure, they've decided instead it would be better not to show it at all. And that is actually another fear that I have about Anduin with the recent human heritage storyline with Vanessa and how people critiqued, again, Anduin doing the work off screen. Anduin is doing all this stuff for the Defias, and he's pardoning the Defias, and he's doing this for the Defias. And people rightfully said, that fucking sucks. It isn't a great way to handle Anduin's story. Again, Anduin is off screen being the best that he can be. He's suffering from sadness, serious sadness, seasonal sadness disease of Anduin's whole life. But still, he's doing the best. He's trying his best, but he can't help that these people are not accepting his help.
He managed to lead 2 world wars back to back and also lead all of his kingdom perfectly.
Perfectly. I hope that the writers don't see that and immediately shy away from the idea of being able to show Anduin trying to make direct amends for things that Stormwind's done. But they just need to digest that as people wouldn't mind seeing that. As long as, again, like we've discussed before, the characters around Anduin react in the appropriate ways. I'm pretty sure a lot of the Defiers would tell Anduin to go, shove it. Vanessa especially. Vanessa should hold no love towards Anduin whatsoever. And not only that, but there'd be a lot of people, not just the nobles, not just the mustache-twirling nobles shaking their heads at Anduin's plan. I'm pretty sure a lot of the people of Stormwind, it'd be kind of a mixed bag of reactions. I'm pretty sure that some people would really dislike the Defiers. I'm pretty sure people would be very much Defier sympathizers, things like that. Instead, we just get a very simplified view again, and then I often are left with the worry of, I hope the devs just don't leave it at that and never touch on it again from Anduin's perspective because of the critiques that we are now giving Anduin. But by the by, now, where were we up to in Anduin's story? We were getting to Wolfheart, and we were getting to essentially the closing part of Anduin engaging with the Twilight Cultist.
Yes. It was basically the closing of his story in Cataclysm, which was him finding his faith, him kind of fully becoming a priest through the divine intervention he called to resurrect his father. And that very much informs a lot of the interesting ideas of his faith and his seeking out of his priestly nature was in defiance of what his father wanted from him. And yet that priestly nature was what saved his father. It is a very good kind of jumping on point for what his nature as a priest means to his story and means to his themes, where it is ultimately an expression of his best self.
I really like that term too. And also I liked how this, and I think all three of us know, then this essentially set the seeds for possible conflict of the life of a ruler versus the life that truly lets Anduin, pun intended, shine through his connection to the light.
His connections to the light were very much emblematic of his tendency towards proactivity, his tendency towards an active desire to do good, whereas the burdens of the throne are a very reactive thing in the narrative, where even with Varian, and it does tie into a lot of intentional or not greater ideas behind the Alliance, where the Horde acts, the Alliance reacts, where Varian often in his role as king and as High King reacted to what the Horde was doing, and they reacted in a way that often put them on the back foot, even if they did ultimately win.
Yes, I think that's always a very clear narrative trope to, again, scrub the idea of responsibility of the reactive party. The reactive party can never be truly accountable because they never started it. They're just merely reacting, in this case, to things that other people have done to them. It's always through the faults of others that they must act, and begrudgingly act as well. Like, if you weren't doing this, we wouldn't have to act like this. Insert Horde actions here.
Which does lead very nicely into Miss Pandaria.
Yeah, there we go. The center point of this sort of argument. But notably an expansion that was very good for Anduin's character. And I think all three of us can agree with that. This was really, truly Anduin coming into his own as a character.
I would very much argue the foundation of his character, because as much as a lot of the stuff in Cataclysm did set up the concepts, it was very much Miss Pandaria that actually showed it to the player base, that showed it in action in an active storyline, and not just little blurbs here and there in a short story, in a book, in a small quest line. It was very much the cohesive center theme of Miss Pandaria for the Alliance.
Oh yeah, massively so. Basically with Mr. Pandaria, I believe that the starting point for Anduin is...
Starting point of the expansion.
A starting point of the expansion, ironically, is the compass, and made for Varian's birthday by Anduin.
I had this compass crafted for my father's birthday. I gave it to him a few months before my ship ran aground on Pandaria.
And then essentially going on a diplomatic mission, which again is a nice sort of thing. Also contrasts to Rathian's recent story in Dragonflight and how he was made a diplomat. In the worst possible way. Anduin and the Alliance forces are actually being very active that if they're going out on a diplomatic mission. I mean, how diplomatic this was with soldiers on board, but understandably they do have a small unit of soldiers to protect the prince there on the ship. However, yeah, that sort of led on to Anduin's story. It was a stranger in a strange land, essentially, and he had a lot to learn from there.
Obviously, like I said, one of the biggest ideas behind Anduin in Cataclysm and leading into Miss Pandaria was that idea of proactivity, of going out and making active choices to do good, rather than just being idle, hoping good things come his way and reacting to the bad, where Anduin's initial point in the expansion is what the Alliance as a whole is doing. The Horde chases the Alliance flees. They run aground on Pandaria, the Alliance sends out people to rescue Anduin. The premise of the expansion is to rescue Anduin.
There's no time to waste. We'll send a small elite force to secure this new land and bring back my son.
Because it is in response to what the Horde did. It is very much a reactive piece of the war, and that is very much in contrast to what Anduin later does.
This is the first time that Anduin sort of sets out by himself. He wants to know things. He's already helping the characters around him. I think the first time that the characters find Anduin in Mr. Pandaria from memory is basically they say, come on, you need to come home. This mission's already been a failure because of, again, the Horde. But Anduin refuses, and he wants to learn basically more about Pandaria.
I'm sorry, but I cannot go back just yet. I'm sorry, but I cannot go back just yet.
He wants to learn about the healing, I wanted to say magics, but the healing methods of Pandaria.
Well, also the magics, because of the healing waters of the Veil. That was kind of one of the big inciting things.
I've decided to search for the Veil. I've decided to search for the Veil. I must find the sacred pools and study their healing powers.
With the idea of reactivity versus proactivity, the Alliance and their war were very much there to react to the Horde. The Horde was on a path of conquest under Garrosh, and the Alliance intended their own path of conquest to counteract it. They were very content to, intentionally or not, drive their way through Pandaria and ruin as much as possible in order to stop Garrosh. They were very content to take Anduin and bring him back to Stormwind and let the war machine trudge on and react into the Horde. But that was very much where Anduin diverges from the traditional path of the Alliance and from the path of Varian, where he decides, no, I'm not here to treat this land of mystery as something to uncover for our use. I am here to uncover how to use it for good, how to find the good in this land, how to find what this land could be used beyond war. And so he makes the choice to use shadow magic and mind control someone, which was a very important beat.
Prince Anduin, we've come to take you home. Come quietly now.
I'm sorry, but I won't. I'm sure you understand my reasons.
Eh? Oh, you're absolutely right, Prince Anduin. You're free to go as you please.
And escape from SI7's custody and make his quick escape.
You silly dwarf, he mind-controlled you. Now he's gone.
What? Oh, I can't believe he did that to me.
Exactly, like Anduin very clearly not only wants to learn about Pandaria, but its people too. Me and Syl often discuss, and we actually discussed this in our Rathian video, whoever was writing Anduin in-game for this expansion knew how to write teenagers. This is an odd bit of praise, but Anduin certainly acts like a teenager in this. Like, and people still say, oh, well, you know, he's good and sweet and blah, blah, blah. Anduin's a little bit of a shithead.
Cheeky little bugger. I didn't think he had it in him.
And I kind of like that. He's still got that teenage arrogance about him, as much as people would not like to put that trait on Anduin, especially when he comes into contact with Rathian later in the expansion with an almost judgmental attitude towards Rathian. However, his consistent sort of proximity to Rathian, which I'd like to discuss more. But essentially, Anduin acts like he knows what he's doing. He has his clear vision. He wants to do this, this, and this without really thinking of, obviously, the consequences, because this could definitely cause a diplomatic, and it was causing a diplomatic bit of chaos in regards to his actions, giving his father more things to worry about.
200 ships at my disposal, yet the one carrying my son goes missing.
Anduin, as much as, like, this was an absolute brilliant insight into Anduin's character, it also showed a perfect teenager in this. He wanted to go do his own thing and was very much focused on his own ideas. And that's good. We like that for a character. This is the thing. We like characters who can do stuff like this and people can tell them off about it because it's fair. There is a lot to criticize Anduin here for, don't be naive, don't be so self-obsessed. Think about the people that you may be causing more chaos to around you, because this isn't an easy situation. This is a diplomatic situation, and Anduin just sort of forges ahead.
Because there is also that question of how much is he maybe exacerbating the Alliance presence there by continuing the search for him, by continuing, hey, they would have maybe withdrawn a bit. Obviously made their plans to stop the Horde, but probably withdrawn. But Varian's not going to withdraw as long as his son is missing in Pandaria.
Exactly. It's a great bit of chaos that Anduin introduces.
Well, which I think does generally tie into one of the big reasons I enjoy him in Pandaria, which is his actions, whether morally good, thematically good or not, have consequences. When he makes a choice, even if it is a good choice, he often does have that arrogance. He does have that naivete. He has that very rush into things, so confident in my ideals, so confident in what I believe, that I don't think about what's happening. Which in part does tie into, because obviously he does the stuff with Chi-Ji and the Red Crane.
Master Crane, are you okay? He's succumbing to the Shah.
He does stuff in the Veil. He does kind of the idea of, in his proactivity, he is proving himself to the August Celestials, proving that the factions are worthy of trust.
Thank you, Master White Tiger. You will see. I believe that my people and the Horde are essentially good.
And that is a very good moment of proactivity. That is one of those shining moments of his proactivity, his surety in what he is doing pays off. Sometimes it pays off in negative ways because him doing that is what allows Garrosh in and allows him to corrupt the Veil.
And Anduin also pays for that himself in that he gets crushed by the Veil.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying, and that all leads into the story of Landfall, which is very much the escalation of everything, the escalation of the conflict on Pandaria, where that was going to happen whether Anduin wanted to or not. But Anduin ultimately was the inciting incident for all of that.
This creates actually a good comparison to when people place blame on, let's just say, a character like Rathian for Rathian's actions at the end of Mr. Pandaria. But Anduin here, in regards to the wider community's eyes, it hasn't done anything wrong, TM. But Anduin gets up to a lot of mischief in this expansion, but it's the correct way of approaching a character like this. It adds flavor and depth to the character, which is how people should treat Rathian a bit more with, rather than be like, Rathian's so guilty of everything. Rathian, a spawn of the Void himself, but in comparison, this is a great bit of construction for a character. Like you said, Sil, Anduin does these things, and he does suffer via his mistakes in a plot-related matter. Landfall really encapsulates this as a really good bit of writing in regards to actions and reactions, and Anduin learning, and Anduin also being hit by the responsibilities of his actions.
And also hit by a bell.
And also hit by a bell. They threw a bell on that little gay boy.
One of the reasons why I think I found the Landfall story so compelling, even though I haven't actually played through Mists of Pandaria, I just thought it was this really compelling bit of narrative that Anduin would pay so dearly for his mistakes. Him taking an action leads to consequences, and I think that's one of the last times we really saw that for his character.
It is nice that you can still replay through it. It's unfortunate you can't replay through the other part of the Miss Pandaria story, but Landfall is a very good bit of story that you can play through still.
I'll have to do that on my character sometime.
One other piece of cut content, but I don't think many people actually know about it. Most people know about, obviously, the Rathian Legendary questline, but one piece of content I've always been sad got cut in, it was in-game, but it got removed in 5.4 with the Veil's destruction, was the finale of Anduin's story in base Mists of Pandaria, where it was very much kind of the finale of the good side of his ideals, the virtues of him proving himself to the August Celestials, where they join the Golden Lotus and they defend the people of the Veil from the Mogu. This big holy barrier. He uses his powers as a priest to help the Golden Lotus and stop them and stop a big plot to get this big artifact of the Thunder King.
I think I remember playing that way, way, way back in the day. Did it get removed with the corruption of the Veil?
Yes, it did. It got removed with all of the Golden Lotus questlines.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, yeah, Anduin also suffered the great choices of removing certain things.
To a bit less of a degree, thankfully, because we do see the big important moment still of opening the veil. Although they did edit that of basically saying, you guys suck, but we'll let you in anyways.
Everyone in the Veil giving us the middle finger as we slowly slump our way in. I really do think that that is a good, basically the distilled essence of what Anduin's story should be like. I feel like it's still different from Varian's anger and Varian's willingness to act without thinking. I think the really nice way of putting Anduin's is it's still a flaw, but it is born of his naivety and his inability to sometimes consider the people around him, which is it could make for a very interesting point. A person who's so obsessed about saving people and protecting people that he allows his own actions, though sometimes when he has almost a idea in mind, he's single-minded in following his ideas.
I think single-minded is the best way to put it. Is that shows very much in a virtuous way in base Miss Pandaria, where he uncovers the veil, he helps the people of the veil, he does all of these things to help people in Pandaria. He is very much shown as his steadfastness, his tunnel vision towards helping people, towards doing the right thing, is shown off in a good way.
The Red Crane has always symbolized hope to our people, but in his absence I fear that even my thoughts began to darken.
Think no more on despair, Koro. We have a saying where I'm from. It is darkest just before the dawn.
And then it's shown off in not a bad way, but more in a way that has consequences in Landfall, where obviously we get the very complicated story of the Divine Bell and Dalaran and Darnassus and all of that, which is a very different topic, but an important one given Jaina and the idea we talked about earlier of Anduin and Jaina very much being the only two people in the story with those mentalities, and how Landfall was very much the moment where Jaina lost that, where Jaina was no longer that, but Varian was starting to rise in her place.
This is a little bit of a segue. I'm still shocked after all these years that Anduin still treats Jaina. I mean, if we go just by what is in game at the moment, Anduin has full faith in Jaina and he really loves Jaina, you know. It's his aunt. Jaina is his aunt, air quotes. I'm still very shocked that Anduin, knowing what Jaina did in Dalaran, he still unequivocally trusts her and likes her.
Well, remember, there are certain characters that very much get the idea of not necessarily doing wrong, of when they are reacting to things, it makes it okay because they are reactive, whereas let's just say there is a reason why as early as 2 days ago there are still Twitter debates about the Purge of Dalaran. It is a very contentious and complicated issue in the story, to put it lightly. It's one I love. If I'm to go on a side tangent about it, I love the Purge of Dalaran, in part because of how it ties into the morality of characters, where every single person involved in the Purge is wrong. Everyone has their reasons for doing what they do, and then they take it a step further and go too far. Aethys, he has his reasons for wanting to play coy, but then he takes it a step too far and just doesn't communicate to anyone. He causes the situation because he just refuses to tell Lorthamar, refuses to tell Jaina. He keeps it all to himself because he has this need to please people. Lorthamar goes too far in that he's not telling the leader of a city with a major population of Blood Elves that he's considering joining the Alliance. He keeps it secret. Varian, similarly, keeps it secret, doesn't tell Jaina. The one peacekeeping person who he not 5 minutes ago was trying to convince to join the Alliance again, and she says no because of her desire for peace and neutrality with the Blood Elves, doesn't tell her about her friends. And then Jaina and Varisa, obviously, they are right to distrust the Horde. They are right to be shocked at what the Horde did. They are right to react to what the Horde did. And then they take it a step further and enact an ethnic cleansing.
That is a good bit of storytelling, but it's because people often try to seek, well, who's responsible and who is to blame? And like you said, it's a matter of everyone doing the wrong thing and basically a series of unfortunate events leading up to this situation. I feel like the thing that's actually let that down is then later on character reaction stat.
A lot of those very well written moments are let down later by the aftermath of ultimately Jaina suffers no repercussions from that, where Jaina is largely forgiven, she is largely absolved of it. She leaves Kirin Tor later, but everyone in the Kirin Tor still likes her, and the one character who does blame her in BFA is a villain who we almost kill and then leave.
It's very much like Jaina is quite often not responsible for the actions that she does, even though there is also discussion about Talanji's father. The death of Rastakhan.
It's forever interesting because she is actually not responsible for that, Gen is.
Yeah, Gen is. And neither of those two characters suffer any repercussions. Jaina does have an important part in regards to a relationship with Anduin and how they both interact with each other. And I will say this though, if Talanji doesn't flying leap kick Anduin in the head, or at least try and like beat him to within an inch of his life in the War Within, if they meet, I'll be very disappointed. Although it would be very, very funny for a Talanji Anduin friendship, like a enemy frenemy ship, you know, like they just fucking hate each other's guts, but they put up with each other. That'd be alright. On a sort of actual serious side note, Talanji has definitely suffered a lot more in regards to never getting any sort of closure in her story compared to these characters.
We will probably bring up Jaina later more on the idea of actions having very logical consequences in Mists of Pandaria and having that much less so in later expansions, which is the same with Anduin, where to tie back to Landfall with the idea of the more present topic for Anduin was the Divine Bell, was the Mallet, and how he went on this very long quest to find the Harmonic Mallet as a means to stop it. And there were those very obvious parallels of Anduin representing the virtues of the Pandarian and Garrosh representing the virtues of the Mogu. And how that all came to a head at that end where Anduin, even though prior in the patch he had his reunion with Varen, he had his moment of, we are reunited, we're on the same page as to what needs to be done in Pandaria. They even had that moment again when addressing the Shah. They had those very clear moments of, okay, Varian is learning from his son. He is learning the virtues that his son is trying to instill. Not even necessarily actively trying to instill, but he is learning from the good deeds of his son.
That's a good way to put it. He's learning from the good deeds of Anduin and the flow and effect that Anduin's positive traits of patience, of respect, and eagerness to learn and understand. I think that's another one, an eagerness to understand a situation and to react accordingly were rubbing off on Varian, where Varian approached things with a element of suspicion. Anduin approached it with, okay, we have reasons to be suspicious, but let's give this a try, which was always a very good trait. That's a very positive thing for a character to learn from another one. And like you said, then introducing Garrosh, and again, I still think this is one of the best bits of writing too. Despite all of that, Anduin goes and forges off by himself again, which is a dumb teenage maneuver.
It's one of those interesting moments that I don't think a lot of people really mention, is the parallels between Garrosh and Anduin, of their very stubborn steadfastness, their inability to turn away from their path in a way, and that it might manifest in a lot more virtuous ways in Anduin, but they are very similar in that, especially in that moment where Anduin goes off on his own despite best advice, tries to stop Garrosh, and Garrosh continues to do what he does despite best advice.
That's actually a really, really good way of putting it. Mr. Pandaria really shines through, and we're going to talk about this in later depth, is the ability to set up other characters as foils for Anduin, where later expansions struggle with that, because we'll talk about Sylvanas and trying to set up Sylvanas as Anduin's foil, and the repeated and failed attempts of trying to do that. Garrosh, again, he's a sort of a mirror character to Anduin in regards to this. I wouldn't say that Garrosh is a foil per se, but he's a mirror character, like a dark mirror, essentially, for Anduin.
Which is interesting because he is also a mirror to Varian. It's one of those interesting ideas of how he parallels both main characters of the Alliance and the expansion so differently.
Exactly. So it makes for a really, really good villain in the scope of Mr. Pandaria. This was good writing. It created very, very interesting points here. And then the result of all of this, after Anduin gets the Divine Belt, I always forget the bit with the Monkey King, but I always remember it because of the Hearthstone thing, when people were excited about Anduin's Hearthstone story and they put the Monkey King instead of Rathian. Going off on a side tangent there. Now, this is one of Anduin's major flaws that I'd like to touch on a bit more later. The idea of allowing abusers, let's just say we're going to put a frame around Garrosh, he is a serial abuser of his power, essentially a serial abuser of the people around, people's trust around him. I often touch on this point. It's good to forgive people who are sorry about their actions. And they've not only just words, but they have taken distinct, clear actions to change their behaviors. It's both the verbal and the physical. Physical in the most like nebulous sort of sense here. The attempts of apologizing for one's actions and then also leading through on those apologies, both important parts of a genuine change in behavior. And it's good that when someone makes those clear and obvious attempts, that you can forgive that person. There's no guarantee that you will forgive that person, but it's a reasonable thing to forgive someone who has made a mistake and then tries to change their ways. However, if you're a person who sees a person who is abusing this trust or abusing others in a manner that continuously repeats itself, is secular the person's behavior. Saying that I will forgive you or I will be able to change your mind opens up for hurting those around you. And this plays into a really good weakness of Anduin, as in he almost enables Garrosh to do what he does by either in this, by saying, no, we can still change Garrosh's mind. And we see this a lot in the War Crimes book too. The constant belief that you can change someone's mind, you can make them better, even though said person makes no effort and makes it clear that they have no intention to change. Said person is an enabler. And that's what Anduin basically falls under, whether it's through his childish naivety or otherwise. Anduin is so sure in his own righteous beliefs of being able to change people and that this will have a positive effect on Garrosh. He picks the worst possible person and then sticks with that. And again, Anduin's single-mindedness about being able to change Garrosh's behavior and be like, no, we can understand each other. You don't need to take these sorts of actions, Garrosh. Anduin essentially, in a way, enables Garrosh's behavior to change, because this isn't the first time that Garrosh has done this.
In a way, he also enables Garrosh's continuation of it, because his belief in Garrosh's dignity, his belief in Garrosh's desire to change is why he removed the shackles on his feet. It's why he made them do that in the trial, because even despite everything Garrosh was saying to him, all the mockery, all the horrible things he said about his mother, about Arthas, he still wanted him to change with all of that, despite no evidence that would ever happen. And as a result, immediately after that, when the trial happens, Garrosh disappears. Garrosh gets away. He causes warlords, which leads into Legion, which nobody ever blames Anduin for.
No, we all know who we should blame for all of this. Teasing aside there. And that is a good weakness of Anduin, though. This is the thing that anyone who's listening to this could possibly go, no, you're saying that Anduin's an enabler? No, you can't say that. And it's a complex issue. There is a point where you need to put down boundaries with a person. And Anduin is unable to do this in this story because of his own stubbornness and need to prove himself that people can change in regards to that. And ironically enough, Garrosh and Rathian are basically not parallel, the opposites to each other, that they're also mirrors in a sense that Rathian does take it upon himself to change, both in his actions and his viewpoint and realizing the mistakes he made and making a strong effort to try and change from there. However, Rathian isn't granted that allowance by Anduin, ironically enough. Rathian is granted barely any reprieve from Anduin in the story. On the flip side, Garrosh is granted a lot of reprieve from Anduin during all of this.
It's one of those interesting ideas where they do a really good job in Pandaria of showing the reasons why his virtues have merit by showing a way in which his desire for those things works, and then showing a way in which it works less so, where, like we said, with showing his virtues in the base story and then showing how they work less with the Divine Bell, where they show how his desire to have people change works with Varian, and then he tries it again with Varian's foil in Garrosh, and that works significantly less so. But you can see why he has the belief in that. It is very logical why he believes people are able to do that.
And I think that also leads into that flip of...
Did we lose Sam again? Oh no. I think the thing that I like the most about mop lore for Anduin is he's allowed to make mistakes and kind of learn from them. Like, he's not treated as this reactive character. Like, he has goals, he has ambitions, he has things that he wants to do and he wants to accomplish. And it's also kind of like encapsulates him as like what he wants to do as like a priest, which is to like go out into the world and like help people or to try and have an effect on the world around him.
There should be plenty of antivenom, thanks to this adventurer.
Definitely, it's one of those things where, like I said, it's a very simple thing on its surface, but Anduin's actions have consequences. There are good consequences, there are bad consequences, but he is playing an active role in the story, and other people are reacting to him in turn in ways that can help or harm him. Like, Garrosh doesn't just sit there and say, oh no, you stopped my master plan, end of plot. He smashes a bell on Anduin's face.
And there's this really great moment after he gets crushed by the bell where the player character kind of goes up to him, and there's this like quest text about how he's lying there, you know, and like the wind ruffles his hair. And like that's like a bit of angst that I feel like is really earned at that point, because there was all of that build up to that moment. It's kind of the consequences of Anduin's actions, and it's kind of like, oh, well, this is kind of what he wrought. I think that's kind of like one of those moments where like the angst was like earned in a way.
And like we said, the idea of him being very single-minded, very tunnel vision in his ideals of, it's not that he's stupid to go in like that, it's that he is so focused on doing that right thing, on stopping Garrosh and making sure this horrible plan doesn't go through, rightly so, that in this case, the lack of care he has is for his own well-being. It is for his own survival, and it doesn't make what he did wrong. What he did was in fact very necessary, because Garrosh would have done horrible things if he hadn't, but he still puts himself very much over risk in front of big Sha-infested Horde army and the war chief of the Horde, who is very violent, right in front of him. And then we see the logical consequences of that. And it's one of those very rare moments where we see the player get a little of personality, where most of the time the player is very just kind of a cameraman, just kind of there to show us the actual player, the plot. Whereas in this Pandaria, there's a lot of moments where like our stuff with Lore Walker Cho, we get those little moments of like, we can paint Anduin.
Who is this? A prince, you say? A child? But he has had no childhood. You can see it in his eyes.
What is our purpose here? Our purpose here is Anduin. We can show that to them. We have all these interactions and these little friendships with Anduin over the course of the expansion. And that culminates in that little moment of relief when we see Anduin not being dead under the bell.
Right. We've kind of developed this relationship with him, the NPC. So like we become invested in his story. We're like right there beside him during Landfall, or at least what I understand of Landfall. You're kind of working with him.
Like we said, he pretty much is the main Alliance character for Miss Pandaria. He is the person that, above anyone else, we quest with most consistent.
Right.
Also, hello everyone.
Hello, welcome back.
Continuing story of being the most disconnecting motherfucker on the planet here.
I'm so sorry Australia has it out for you tonight.
Anyway, where were we up to, guys? What were we talking on?
Landfall and the kind of actions and consequences that kind of actually happened in Miss Pandaria. It's one of those larger things where obviously it ties into the idea that Anduin is very much the moral center of Pandaria. He is the best representation of the Pandaren ideals, which are supposed to be like the thing to aspire to. But it doesn't mean that the plot just goes, Anduin does a good thing and everything is happy, end plot. It has moments of Anduin does the right thing, but that doesn't just mean people aren't going to still fight against that. People are still going to go, no, despite all odds. People are still going to fight against what is logically the good thing because of their own stubbornness, which Garrosh, if anyone, is stubbornness personified. And he very much decides, okay, you're going to do that, I'm going to murder you.
And I think that leads to our next point, the sort of middling to the end parts of Mr. Pandaria. Anduin then is sent to recover by the Mistweavers, which links in again to the earlier part in the story when Anduin was trying to find the healing magics of Pandaria and learn about the Mistweavers and stuff like that. And also, Mr. Notorious comes in, the man himself.
Which I will preface with a little bit of a story. Prior to Miss Pandaria, I was not in much of the data mining community. I was not much in the PTR. It was very much that whole buy this 1 year thing and get access to Miss Pandaria beta that really first got me into like story testing, into seeing what is to come for WoW. Prior to Miss Pandaria, that wasn't really a thing beyond like maybe There were some like little bits of setup for like, oh, you're gonna fight Illidan eventually, obviously, or Arthas is the end boss of this expansion, but there were never really a lot of ongoing plots throughout patches beyond a little bit in Wrath until what we got in Mists of Pandaria, which was a very continuous ongoing story. And that's really where people got invested in kind of seeing what happened next. And I still remember the day that people kind of blew up when the 5.2 PTR first went out and there was this achievement. We had nothing else on the Legendary questline except for the achievement name called Chapter 3, The Two Princes. Speculation was abound about that.
I think I remember some of that too. As much as there was plot in Wrath, I feel like it followed along from a very understandable point.
There was never really any like, what's gonna happen? We all know that Arthas is gonna die.
Yeah, exactly. Like there was no mystery in regards to that, and like parts leading up to it all just felt in part, all parts leading up to the last patch. So we all just sort of accepted it. Although I remember being there for Ulduar and my mind being blown. By the way, that shit was so amazing. Not to go off on a tangent, but fucking Yogg-Saron in Ulduar. Raids back then didn't have a huge amount of storytelling to them, but the visual and actual visual storytelling of Ulduar is still fucking top notch, may I just say.
Well, even there, that was kind of the start of raid storytelling, where there is an actual mission. We led in from the leveling story to stop Yogg-Saron. Oh, turns out the world's gonna blow up. We need to stop Algalon. That really was the only real moment of like speculation in Wrath, was those visions in his head of who is this immolated man that totally isn't Wolfheart.
That was such a good patch. But either way, I digress though. Like you said, people got really into Rathian, and I remember the reception of Rathian back in the day was overwhelmingly positive. This was exciting. This was a big change up. The only other legendary, the Fangs of the Father, was a lead into Rathian's character. Then also having Mr. Pandaria's legendaries be that slowly unwinding sort of story.
And also, I do think there was a big emphasis back then on accessibility to those things, where obviously Fangs of the Father was rogue only, but they published all of the story of Fangs of the Father on YouTube for people to see, and then led that little stinger of, oh, there's this land beyond the mist, perhaps you'll see me again there, which got people like, oh, we're gonna see Rathian again.
With the last of the Black Dragon flight destroyed, my destiny was in my own hands. I left the assassins of Ravenholt behind to seek my destiny elsewhere. There are rumors of a new land beyond the mists of the sea. Perhaps I will see you there.
And notably, with the change of introducing Looking for Raid in Mr. Pandaria, it made the idea of getting legendaries a lot more accessible and being able to engage in this storyline that felt very epic, you know, epic with a capital E here. And I think that's what endeared people very much to Rathian when he was introduced in this storyline. And it was the first time, I would argue, in the entire game history that two younger characters, I'm holding up my finger here and waggling it, two younger characters spent time with each other.
Why did you play that piece just now? It's a Pandaran board game. The object is for both players to win. That's ridiculous. Why would you even play?
And people may be rolling their eyes and be like, well, what does that have anything to do with it? That was a rarity in WoW. There wasn't many young characters who were like a center point, and nor did characters hang around in each other's presence.
Up until then, were there really anyone other than Anduin and Lily?
I don't think there was. I don't think there was any younger characters. Full stop. This is what was, I mean, unintentionally genius, I feel, behind Anduin's character. Introducing a younger character, because a lot of WoW's player base back then was a bit younger. WoW was our first introduction, other than EverQuest or something like that. A lot of people got involved with an MMO. There was an accessible MMO, not counting Phantasy Star Online.
Don't disparage Wizard 101. That was my childhood.
Wizard 101! True. I should not be a hater to the classic of Wizard 101 here. I've seen people argue, well, you know, obviously, Rathian and Anduin are clearly very set up as foils, and people often say, well, they don't like each other. The main point against this was so unusual for Anduin, and so unusual for Rathian, and so unusual for WoW characters, just full stop. These two were together for a whole year. When we saw Anduin, Rathian was there. When we saw Rathian, Anduin was there. These characters, from a visual storytelling perspective, were joined at the hip.
Meet me atop Mason's Folly, where we met before. What are you two plotting? I keep no secrets. You are welcome to accompany us, Anduin Rin, if your injury permits. Truly a splendor. Have you ever seen such a view, Prince Anduin? It's breathtaking.
They never left each other's presence. They went to the Timeless Isle together and was like, all right. And the thing is you can argue all till you're blue in the face and be like, well, Anduin doesn't trust Rathian. If he didn't trust Rathian, he wouldn't be hanging around with him on the Timeless Isle.
It's also the importance of voice acting there, of Anduin having that little slight lack of seriousness, that little slight snark, and Rathian joking back to him, like, oh, you're wise not to.
What are you talking about? I don't trust you. You are wise not to.
There's very much a good rapport between these characters. People can be like, oh, they didn't trust each other. They didn't, air quotes, trust each other, but they were intrigued by each other. And beyond that, the visual storytelling, Anduin especially, that he's close to someone and he's spent not just an adult in his life. It's just really, really important. This is someone, technically, as we've learnt from the Dragonflight Codex now, Rathian is 100% a teen here, as we all knew. Rathian is technically roughly about Anduin's age, as comparable to as a dragon. These characters of the same sort of age and sort of like balance of their personalities and stuff, and spending that much time together with each other. This was like it was groundbreaking for WoW at that time. People weren't friends in WoW. We had alliances and we had people who were acquaintances and we had people who were a part of each other's force, you know, like they spent time together or they were family. Two characters being friends was weird. And spending this much time together with each other. And like I said, this period from like the Rise of the Thunder King, Throne of Thunder and stuff like that, and just before that, was a very long time in Mr. Pandaria. Mr. Pandaria stretched out, especially with like Siege of Orgrimmar and stuff like that. These two characters were never out of each other's sort of vicinity. That was odd. And the thing is that Rathian also made that really interesting contrast for Anduin coming out of that. He'd just been burnt by his belief in Garrosh, and then he runs into another character who's very, very different than him.
Benevolence is a luxury for the strong, young prince. No great empire was ever built with kindness. I'm not so sure about that. But I can tell you no great empire has ever stood the test of time by crushing its own citizens. Remember, the Mogu were overthrown. That should be the lesson of the Thunder King. It's your move, by the way.
Anduin has his own history with the Black Dragons, and wink wink, Anixia had taken him back to his lair, and Black Dragon Whelps was biting at his ankles there.
If you blindly trust a Black Dragon in the search for greater power, are you any better than Garrosh Hellscream?
And here comes this other Black Dragon, and Rathian is brilliant. He too is written brilliantly as a teenager. How anyone can say like, oh my god, you know, Rathian is a teenager. If you run into a teenager, they act like this, everyone, especially around this age.
I am a Black Dragon. I won't need any help. Sure, I knew that. Ha! A lopsided challenge.
They are very, very sure of themselves. Like, some are very confident in their abilities. Some are very confident in their viewpoints and mindsets already at like 14, 15, 16 years old, right? It's a thing of being a kid. And that works brilliantly, whether it is intended or not. Me and Sil often laugh about this, but like, whether it is intended or not, they read perfectly as a pair of teenage friends. And that's what they are.
It's a Pandaran board game. The object is for both players to win. My dear prince.
And the also other brilliant thing of them being foils. Varian in himself is a foil of Anduin, but of course is that parent-child dynamic. A true foil often has, and I'm saying this from a very classical writing perspective, a true foil for a character is often very similar in power dynamics. Again, they're a reflection of the other character with some very major sort of differentiating factors. However, as my favourite phrase goes, same heart, different mind. Both Rathian and Anduin connect because they do have the same end goal. They want peace and things to be organized between the Horde and the Alliance, and they need to be able to stand up to threats in the future through unity.
The war deeply troubles me. A divided Azeroth cannot possibly stand against the darkness.
However, how they approach this is very, very different.
Especially Miss Pandaria.
Especially Mr. Pandaria.
When is it ever wise not to act for the greater good?
Again, both of their negative traits are very reflective of each other. Both of them are very stubborn. Both of them are very single-minded. However, there's a lot of traits between them both that are perfectly reflected.
Both of them love tabletop games. They're competitive gamers.
The object is for both players to win.
That's ridiculous. Why would you even play?
Like, we see the parts of Rathian in this expansion, and Rathian standing on the top of Mason's Folly, Anduin's favourite place in Pandaria, and Rathian looking out and saying, is there anything more beautiful than Azeroth, in a really quiet moment?
Have you ever seen such a view, Prince Anduin?
It's breathtaking.
I often venture out here to think the view is breathtaking. Would you agree?
And Rathian going off and seeking the guidance of the Celestials, and very similar to Anduin. And the Celestials noting very similar sort of beliefs and reflections in both Anduin and Rathian. They long for peace and, things like that, and they do care a lot about the people of Azeroth.
Spoken like a true child of the aspects, always seeking to change the world.
You speak only in terms of one's enemies. A black dragon through and through. You are stronger than your father, young prince. You have friends. Your champion did not allow you to fall.
Live every day with hope in your heart. In doing so, you create the future you dream of.
However, how they approach this is obviously different. Rathian thinks a approach more as per Varian's approach is more effective.
I worry you may be too soft to wear your kingdom's crown, Prince Anduin. You would do well to learn some of your father's hardness.
Tell me, young prince, what is the nature of strength?
The power to crush one's foes. That is strength.
Obviously, the more we need to get this shit done and we can't fuck around. While Anduin believes that he's not fucking around. Fair enough. And he believes that a more diplomatic approach will be the more useful one here. And both of them are both right and wrong in their own ways, which is an interesting thing. Rathian detracts away from that moral standpoint of Anduin in a sense that Rathian knows that they need to act fast, they need to act effectively. How he actually does that, I still say, is a bit called in, because Warlords of Draenor was a very odd expansion to lead from Mr. Pandaria, but that's by the by. Anyway, but the idea of again, very similar goals, but different ways of approaching it. Rathian wants to use Mogu technology against the coming dangers.
I will meet you at the Forge, where together we will create an instrument of legendary power.
To what end? What are you two working towards?
World peace.
Using a Mogu weapon forge whose powers you barely understand.
And also just that general interesting idea of how they view the Mogu, and how obviously Anduin views them from the idea of tyranny and the idea of going too far, whereas Rathian views them as not going far enough.
Thunder King. What a magnificent individual. Could you imagine what his empire would be like today if it had not been overthrown and hidden by the Pandaren?
I couldn't imagine a crueler tyrant. He enslaved this entire continent.
Benevolence is a luxury for the strong, young prince.
About thinking too small and too petty in their ideas of they just wanted unity for power's sake, but Rathian has never been someone about power for power's sake. He is very much, the power he accrues is for the goal of helping Azeroth and for saving Azeroth, and there are two very different ways of going about that, and how those almost interesting ways over time, how Anduin's philosophies temper Rathian's pursuit of power and the reasons why he pursues power, and how ties much later into BFA of just how different Rathian pursues the power to defeat the old gods, and how it's much less at the cost of others, much less emblematic of the worst traits of Pandaria.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It almost compares and contrasts, again, Rathian and Garrosh as someone who has learnt from his mistakes and is willing to adjust for those mistakes, and also the follies of youth. While Garrosh is young himself, ironically, as an orc, but he just keeps on fucking up, man, because he don't give a shit. He's very set in his goals, and he is set in his mindset. Again, the personification of stubbornness. While Rathian is shown to be someone with a sense of guilt, and he has morals, you know, despite all of his teenage bluster. I mean, dare I say, Rathian is the edgy teenager, but it'd be foolish to apply that as he grows. As he becomes an adult, he's no longer the edgy teenager that he was as a child.
It is one of those interesting things where as he ages, Rathian very much, I don't want to say loses, but lessens in his stubbornness. He learns his lessons, he learns his follies, and he very much, by BFA, has realized some of his errors, realized some of the flaws in his ideologies. He is willing to change. He is willing to view things different from black and white. Whereas I think in Mists of Pandaria, both him and Anduin did share a lot of that stubbornness in very different ways, where when Rathian is confronted at the end of Legendary Questline by Tong, he's very dismissive. He is very, you're just a waiter. What?
You mistake your greatest strength for weakness. Do you see this?
You're just a waiter.
Perfect arrogant teenager moment. It's great. Like I said, whoever managed to distill the essence of an arrogant teenager into Rathian's sort of story, but still show those vulnerabilities of youth, right? Like when he was with the Celestials.
I am a black dragon. I won't need any help. Please, don't make me do this. Hope is a belief in a better tomorrow.
You speak, but doubt your own words.
Great Crane, you have not seen what I have seen.
Did such a great job.
That one line is the perfect line of "you're just a waiter" is the perfect teenager line. He has no actual response.
Exactly. He doesn't know how to respond because he is a teenager, and we're like blaming this teenager for like very adult mistakes here.
Oh, you deserve more than that.
He's a dumb kid. And so is Anduin. However, this is the thing that actually defines Rathian away from Anduin here in a more meta sense, is Rathian realizes he did some dumb shit, right? And he had some dumb ideas. I feel that Anduin, as we get from Mr. Pandaria, right? And his final interactions with Rathian and Garrosh and things like that, Anduin never reflects on the foolish mistakes he made as a youth. That is the major tell between their two characters, I think. Anduin is never brought to the front of the narrative to be like, yes, you know what? How my unwavering belief in Garrosh changing hurt those people around me because I didn't look at it from a more adult view, that obviously this man is not apologetic.
I will say, there is one thing I think he has applied that to, whether intentionally or not, and that is Rathian himself, of him viewing what he did with Garrosh and the subsequent actions of Rathian there as a result as a moment of someone he can't trust anymore, someone he does think did betray him and can't come back from it.
And I think we have some interesting things to say in regards to like how the framing of that within Anduin's story and his relationship to Varian and his relationship to Rathian still holds true, and how he was willing to so very easily forgive Garrosh in this case, but less so with Rathian. We have to go, why is that? Why is that in the story, whether intentional or not? Why would someone hold a grudge against someone in regards to that?
Oh, you deserve more than that.
So, anyway, we'll get to that. I'm winking, by the way, for the entire audience. Listen, I'm winking, by the way. We'll get to that. The difference between Garrosh and Rathian never encourages anyone to trust him. Notably, I want to say that Rathian's words of saying you're wise not to trust me doesn't belie his actions later. However, and this is the thing, this is so fucking different from Garrosh to Rathian. Anduin was like full on like, I'm gonna change Garrosh, you can be different, we can work together, I believe in you, to then Rathian, who he's very on the surface level distrusting of.
If you blindly trust a black dragon in the search for greater power, are you any better than Garrosh Hellscream? I don't trust you.
But when you actually get down to it internally, he does trust Rathian.
He does trust Rathian.
You see a lot of that in War Crimes, where when they're out doing their walks, he asks if they're friends, Rathian agrees, and it's one of those very small moments of good fighting in him.
Yes, exactly. And I posit this. I think Anduin trusted Rathian a lot more, but he was unable to display that in an emotional way. And I'm sort of leading into the point here that despite everything, one of Anduin's traits is he's very emotionally constipated. He likes a sob story. He likes a already bad case of this person not going to change, to try and change, rather than someone that he knows he can actually inherently trust. And that hurt him more when he didn't exactly see that like air quotes betrayal coming. And the betrayal was less so Rathian's knocking out Anduin so Garrosh can escape, slash was Rathian knocking out Anduin so that Anduin didn't rush off right in front of Garrosh and Garrosh yeeted him through 20 fucking walls or so.
Yeah, I feel like that's one thing that's like overlooked all the time, is that the reason why Rathian knocked Anduin out instead of killing him was because he wanted to save him from the confrontation that was about to happen.
Yeah, a very, very terrible conflict where people were killing each other, their alternate universe selves, and it's one of those very interesting things where when you look at Rathian through most of Mists of Pandaria, and obviously through Cataclysm, he is a very harsh person. He is very quickly willing to go to the violent ends for things because he sees that as necessary. But Anduin is the one person he is willing to sit there and debate things with, sit there and talk things through with, sit there and just quietly, peacefully knock him out. Not even like hurt him, knocking him out.
The most minor bump to the head. It's very telling for both of their characters, despite their differences, how well that builds that foil dynamic between them. Like I said, you don't see this behavior between them with anyone else. And I know that people would say, oh, well, Anduin's always like willing to listen and, you know, talk with people. Not in this sort of like level. He really, like, despite the lady doth protesteth too much, Anduin was very fascinated with Rathian and he was willing to spend a lot of time with Rathian.
Rathian challenged Anduin.
That is one of the big things I've always brought up, is in contrast to a lot of recent stuff, Anduin, like I've said, he is ultimately morally right in Mists of Pandaria, but he has characters who challenge his ideals. Even if those people might not necessarily be right in the end, Rathian is ultimately wrong. Like, the end point of his legendary questline is Tong straight up saying, you were wrong to do it this way. You were wrong to try and seek one ultimate dominating faction.
Always you speak, never do you listen. You ignore the lessons of Pandaria. There is balance in all things. So it is with your alliance and your horde. They are not strong despite one another. They are strong because of one another.
But you still get to see him go through that and challenge others through his own convictions. You see him challenge Anduin's ideas.
Benevolence is a luxury for the strong, young prince. No great empire was ever built with kindness.
I'm not so sure about that. But I can tell you no great empire has ever stood the test of time by crushing its own citizens. Remember, the Mogu were overthrown. That should be the lesson of the Thunder King. It's your move, by the way.
I worry you may be too soft to wear your kingdom's crown, Prince Anduin. You would do well to learn some of your father's hardness.
Are you lecturing me?
He actually gets someone to go, are you right about that? Why do you think this? Are you sure that will hold up if X or Y happens? And it's the same with Varian, where those two both worked really well with Anduin as people to put a narrative obstacle for everyone just accepting that they're right and everyone is happy and we have a good ending. There are people who oppose what he's doing, even if he is ultimately right.
And not only that, but even though Anduin is, like you said, on a wider scope correct in this matter, he does cause a lot of damage to the people around him in the pursuit of this. Even though it's not really focused on by the narrative, the people that Garrosh hurts in the end, Anduin allowing so many times for his forgiveness or his understanding definitely leads to that, and that's sort of glossed over by the plot. It was Anduin that Garrosh was talking to. Like you said, Anduin was the one who directly released Garrosh's feet from the shackles. Anduin allowed him time and time to be heard again, even though we went to this trial. From a lawyer's perspective, worst trial ever. I say that with expertise here. It wasn't that Anduin did this flawlessly, which I think is the interesting thing. Even though from a wider perspective he is right, air quotes, he didn't do it flawlessly. he learnt things along the way. He suffered along the way, but a suffering that was equal to the mistakes that he made, which makes it interesting and dynamic. He's not just suffering for suffering's sake. He's not just suffering because someone mind controlled him. He's suffering because he's a teenager and he doesn't always make the best. He has the best things at heart. He's a good lad, but he still makes dumb decisions. And even though those dumb decisions, only really the Garrosh thing led to fucking bad news, and trying to stop Garrosh led to bad news for him with Bellitis, Bonitis from Bellitis on his head. It really does provide that sort of more nuanced look at Anduin's behavior and Anduin's beliefs. And we're looking at this from something that was back in 2012. This is 12 years ago, this story writing. This was pretty damn good for back in the day. From an MMO point of view, this was pretty damn good. Mr. Pandaria definitely has its flaws, but Anduin's story itself is actually quite intriguing. And you can imagine someone playing this back then being like, even us all looking back at it now, we're like, this is pretty damn good. It gives a lot of dynamics to it, gives Anduin a lot of foils to question his choices in life. It creates a lot of like proactive events in Anduin's story that he can be a air quotes hero in regards to this manner. Also, Syl, do you wanna add on that?
No, I was gonna just say consequences as well, with the bell crushing him and him having light infused bones for the rest of his life.
Light infused bones, let's go.
That is a very complicated issue.
That is an issue where it could be explored very interestingly, but the game has just forgotten about it, or it's just made it a very unfortunate implications in regards to it so far.
Or magic superpower.
Magic superpowers for the goodest of boys, TM, with Anduin. I think that Mr. Pandaria, other than the lead into escaping to Draenor, which I think is still one of the dumbest things. Me and a tone. Draenor? Rathian goes to Draenor with Garrosh.
He doesn't even go with him, is the funny thing. We don't even know where Rathian goes.
I know! Well, Rathian is at Khadgar's tower in Warlords.
Yes. Just little whelp that flies off and then does nothing else.
Does nothing else. Like, the story, gone. I wish it would have framed it more. Actually, a more interesting point would have been if Garrosh actually did knock out Rathian too, or injure Rathian in his escape, and Rathian just has to turn tail and hide out with his tail between his legs or something. The whole Warlords of Draenor thing is a bit silly, but I can understand why they were like, we need Gul'dan back. But again, it's like, I'm sort of like wiggling my hands here. Bronze, dragon, time, magic, whatever. It's one of those all wacky wow writing that sort of led into that. But either way, I think that sort of like concludes, other than things covered in the War Crimes novel, how willing Anduin was to go above and beyond to hear out Garrosh really was like compounded in this book, essentially. I think personally as a flaw of Anduin, because it creates a good foil for Anduin, is actually not even a foil. I feel, again, Garrosh is a mirror character, an antagonistic mirror character for Anduin, as in they both share that stubbornness, and they also share it with Varian. So all three of them are ridiculously stubborn. Rathian also has that stubbornness of his young age and his teenagehood. Rathian is willing to make big sacrifices because he believes it to be necessary.
Oh, sure, another year of fighting, enormous casualties trying to take Thunder Bluff, but the rest of the Horde would have caved eventually.
But as the Celestials point out, he's very, very unsure of that.
You speak, but doubt your own words.
He actually doesn't believe that what he's doing may even do it, so he goes to the extremes to see that to at least happen. Even though I think that if a better situation would reveal itself to Rathian would have had no issue in immediately changing tack to go with that, which I feel a lot it compounds the Garrosh thing. It's like, well, what's my best chance here? Well, maybe Garrosh will get out this huge army and let's go from there. With Rathian, it's that sort of desperation almost in a way. He has a plan, but he's also knowing that he's just one little guy. He is very well aware of his little guy sort of level here.
Great Crane, you have not seen what I have seen. The fires that once burned the sky will return. It is inevitable. Who are we? One divided world to stand against a legion.
And I think he sees that a lot with Anduin, as he sees Anduin with these big, lofty goals, and he realizes the limitation of his own strength and also Anduin's strength there, that he's willing to make bad decisions for the possibility of having power. It's not power for power's sake.
It's also one of those interesting ideas of their foil, in that I think Rathian is very conscious of how small he is in the grand scheme and how much more the world needs to stand up to what he's seen.
We are a point of light in a universe of shadow, a candle in a tempest.
Whereas Anduin is very sure that he can do things alone.
I'm not so sure about that.
He is very sure that he is able to solve the issues on his own, even if he logically is not. And he is willing to eschew the factions to do that. Whereas Rathian is very conscious of the fact that the world at large needs the factions, be they united or conquered or whatever, in order to stand up and save the world.
That also kind of ties into the ending of War Crimes, where Anduin is similarly confident. He's like, Rathian, why don't you ask me to help you? I can help you solve this. I can help you fix this. And Rathian knows, like, no, you can't help me. Like, the Legion is something that's like beyond your ability to stop.
Yeah, aware of his own mortality for Rathian, Anduin less so. Grandiose ideas, you know, like the folly of the hero.
Not just mortality, but like ability to have an impact on the world. The ability to like get results, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And I think this was when Anduin's hero story was the strongest, as in not being able to understand his limitations is a good story for a hero, because then the later story will start teaching that hero his limitations and how to overcome those, or the difficulties then he experiences doing that, and then a general thing. And even though I don't like using air quotes the hero's story or the hero's journey too much, because writing is a very fluid discipline, I always think. There is certain narrative structure and narrative builds and things like that, but you can play with it a lot faster and looser in MMOs. But from a technical standpoint, this would be the point where it's like Anduin's hero story is starting. We now have a foundation of who he is as a person and things that he's suffered now at this younger age, that now we can begin his hero story. And I think this is a good lead into, well, we're going to skip Warlords of Draenor because that was pretty much a non-story.
I would say before then, do we want to talk about the very relevantly said line from in-game Rathian of not being held account to the sins of his father? Because we did kind of brush over that in regards to their foil.
True. The connections between the legacy of their father. Syl's favorite word in the universe when talking about Rathian now.
Legacy.
Legacy?
Legacy.
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 Legacy. Legacy. Legacy. Legacy.
Legacy. Legacy.
Legacy.
Legacy. My legacy.
What's such a useful, powerful word in regards to Rathian's view of bettering himself and bettering what he was going to leave behind, now tortured into a hollow shell of oneself.
In the context of Mists only, it was a lot more interesting.
Again, the perfect foil between Anduin and Rathian, and also the difficult feelings towards father figures.
I cannot do this, Father.
And now, my father is only remembered as Deathwing.
And Rathian's disregarding what Dragonflight may say in regards to this. In regards to Mr. Pandaria, Rathian was very much scared of the idea of Deathwing. He was willing to face Deathwing, but he did not hold reverence except for the idea of an Earth Warder. Deathwing himself scared Rathian, and we saw that with the Celestials, that Rathian was distraught when forced to fight Deathwing because of the sheer terror.
What? Wait. Father, please, don't make me do this. Enough! Make it stop.
Rathian is afraid that he will become his father through his own means or otherwise.
Which is one of those interesting moments of difference and foil where both of them don't want to be like their father. They do not want to be the legacy that they have at that moment. But where Rathian is left with a mad father he had to help kill, and a now dead father who he has to deal with, the set in stone, this is his legacy. Anduin's is a lot more malleable. Anduin has those opportunities to make his father better, to have a father with a better legacy to live up to. And it's one of those interesting things that even I didn't really think about until you just pointed out, where with Rathian having that terror of even facing his father, Anduin in many ways had that too in Wolfheart when he got hurt by him. The sheer terror of having to confront your father, having to confront their legacy directly to them. And that difference between Wrathion not having the chance to truly do it, he has to face the flat out reality of what his father is, whereas Anduin gets the luxury of being able to change that, at least at the moment.
It's a much happier obviously a much happier resolution for Anduin, and having that sort of sense of closure, which you would think with how Legion then sets up Varian's death. And even though it's sudden and violent in regards to Varian's death, you would think that from that alone, Anduin would have a sense of closure in regards to his father, because while not the perfect relationship while they're alive, Anduin at least had that sort of sense. He had confronted his father. He was able to change at least a part of his father's mindset, and at least to Anduin reach a point in their relationship that he had respect for his father, and he did love his father in a way that didn't belie Varian's past, but at least acknowledged it and noted that they were moving on from that, which is really, really interesting. Wrathion, of course, has just trauma upon trauma forced upon it.
Enough! Make it stop!
If anyone in this game who should have PTSD, it is Wrathion here.
Which does make it all the more frustrating that when he does meet his father again in Dragonflight, that fear is very much not there anymore.
My legacy.
It's really, really odd. But that can, at least, I will actually stick up for the writers there. You could argue that Wrathion all along knew that wasn't even the shade of Niltharion within Aberrus. He just knew it was fake from the start. But of course, because the storytelling in Dragonflight lets it down because of the wonky way that they wrote Wrathion, we don't really know this, because half the story was spent on comedy and belittling Wrathion, and then when we got to the raid and actually started getting some serious story, we could have had this set up a lot earlier, that Wrathion had his doubts that Aberrus would have anything trustworthy or worthwhile inside of it. That would have been a much more interesting setup, that they're drawn to Aberrus, but they don't think there's going to be anything worthy inside. But they have to stop Zaraketh and blah blah blah. Even Niltharion's shade within Aberrus was a faceless one, so it was like that wasn't even Niltharion to begin with. Wrathion got negged by an old god repeatedly. Anyway, laughter aside there, even if Sibelian and Wrathion 100% had their doubts, we couldn't tell that from earlier in the story, because the story was that busy and touching on irrelevant points rather than them doubting what they were seeing in, Zaralek Cavern, or even working out that if we work together we can see through the trickery in here, and just coming to maybe a conclusion that they obviously don't need any sort of power from Niltharion, but they're gonna have to go to Aberrus because Zaraketh's in there causing trouble. Even the line before they went into Aberrus being don't trust anything that your eyes might see, and then both of them going saying, yeah, I don't think anything that we're going to see in here is going to be the real deal. Then Niltharion turning up, and then characters being should we trust this, But of course, the weight and the power with how Mr. Pandaria's points with Wrathion and Deathwing were written were totally lost in Dragonflight.
That brings up one of those interesting things with Wrathion there, is that with Wrathion, all of his ideas of, I'm willing to go to the lengths of tyranny, I'm willing to go to the lengths of conquering, for him were all largely hypothetical. It was all at most the player character going out and doing things for him, but he was never someone who actually had to face the reality of all that, which is what makes what happens subsequently with Warlords, with Legion, of him basically getting a big slap in the face of consequences of his actions, of, okay, this is the reality of what that stuff might mean, and kind of realizing, no, he is not willing to go that far. He is perhaps more on the side of Anduin with things.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that, Wrathion is the perfect definition of a keyboard warrior in this case. He can talk big, but until that actually started happening to him, he very much revealed himself as a teenage lad. He's talking these big things like, I'm going to be so tough, I'm going to do all this, I'm going to do all this. But like we've discussed before, he doesn't even kill the black dragons that we go out to, and these black dragons are already lost. Wrathion only sees the fallout of it, essentially. Wrathion talks big, but he's essentially a very scared, lonely character.
Great Crane, you have not seen what I have seen. Sometimes I think it was the very precariousness of our world that drove my father to madness.
a very fearful character, actually. He's brave in a sense that he confronts those and keeps going, but deep in his heart, it's that sort of like terror that forces him to keep on going on. So he talks big, because that makes him seem big and strong and brave.
To do what is right, no matter the cost. That is wisdom. The power to crush one's foes. That is strength. The strength to overcome any hardship. This is fortitude. Hope is a belief in a better tomorrow.
You speak, but doubt your own words.
And it's one of those interesting differences to Anduin, where I would not consider Anduin a very fearful character. And it's one of those things where Anduin gets moments of fear in the, oh shit, the consequences of my actions, or a very sudden, oh, this is happening now. Like, he was not fearful of Varian when he was confronting him until Varian accidentally hurt him. And then suddenly he was very afraid. He was not afraid of Garrosh until suddenly a bell on his head. And then he was very afraid.
Whether it is some sort of like divine intervention, they wrote both of them as, you know, kids. There were kids in Mr. Pandaria, and these are the things that kids feel invincible, kids feel invulnerable. Even if they're scared, you know, they can hype themselves up and out of it, essentially, until consequences hit. And I feel that people forget that about Mr. Pandaria. It is really truly almost a miniature coming of age for both Rathian and Anduin to the harms of the world. Like, they're very brave with each other. They love talking big to each other about how brave they both are and how cool and thoughtful they are. You know, and that's the thing, they bounce off of each other really, really well. Perfect foil dynamics. They're very equal in their power dynamic.
It is the moment also where he gets to show his personality the most, where Anduin gets to be snarky, he gets to be smarmy, he gets to be a little shit to Rathian.
You're what, 2 years old?
They play as really good friends to each other, as even War Crimes as a book. Like, they reveal things that they actually do want. Like, Anduin, in a moment of weakness, wants to run away, and for a second, Rathian's kind of like, yeah, we could run away. You know, and that sort of like hangs in the air. And then, of course, we'll face it like brothers.
It's a good moment to kind of end on, of that moment in War Crimes, of Rathian offering, when he's a little older, to ferry him on his back and take him to places and do things that would age your father 10 years in one night. And Anduin just going, you have no idea how good that sounds.
It's a real moment of honesty. I genuinely think, like, in that bit, Rathian was also telling the truth. He knows that he can't do it, but a good part of him, he wants to do that too. There would be no better thing just to forget all of this and just go off and do that. And it's not about winning over Anduin's trust there, because he already knows he has Anduin's trust. Totally. It's very telling for those two characters. They see each other for what they are. They trust each other from very early on, even though they say, you know, like, it's good that you don't trust me. And we all know Rathian's line, and so is Anduin. They do trust each other already. It's a really good sort of tell in regards to two younger characters finding someone very similar but very different than each other. Really good narrative foils. And then working off of that, seeing both their strengths and weaknesses and how they interact and how their true personalities start coming through. Rathian's easily abashed. Rathian almost flustered by Anduin's sort of like quippy remarks. Like, Rathian isn't always this cool, calm, collected sort of like character. It really shows a really interesting and powerful dynamic in regards to these two characters, and it follows all the way through to obviously ends of Mr. Pandaria. So, and it really does show, like, through their own conversations, the conversations that they have with each other is also showing their sense of agency. They're willing to spend time with each other because they want to spend time with each other. I mean, Anduin could have immediately gone off with Varian, not back home, but just to like Varian's sort of like settlement. I mean, there would be healers there, like the Mistweavers would easily come to there as well. Mason's Folly and the Tavern in the Mist was just an easy location, essentially. Velen already helped, like we said, light infused bones. But Anduin still chooses to be there with Rathian, and he still goes to the Timeless Isles with Rathian as well. It's Anduin showing agency even in his choice of friends. And like I said, and it's trusting someone. Even though, very opposite to Garrosh. Garrosh is like, no, Garrosh, I'll listen to you, you can change. The first time that Anduin has a real friend, he's almost a little bit abashed by it, I think is the correct word. He wants to be vulnerable, but it's still that period of growth in their friendship as well. This is the actual visual storytelling. They're both together all the time. in those patches all the time. As much as they're like, I don't trust you. What are you up to? What the hell are you talking about? They're still there. And they're still there together. And that's what makes them really good and interesting foils. They question each other. They share very similar viewpoints in their hearts, but mentally they approach it very differently. They both suffer from the follies of youth, but it shows how similar a character they are, and especially with Rathian's growth later. However, as we will discuss now, I think, is how Anduin starts to change as a character, and not for the better. Anduin starts becoming very static as a character, while Rathian, ironically enough, grows as a character. Anduin's response to that is a very static sort of response. And this is the thing, I still think in Legion, there was a very good time in regards to Anduin still being full of, like, how do I describe it? Possibilities with his character.
Potential, yeah.
Yeah, potential here. There was definitely some room for, like, exploring what it meant to be king. And I genuinely, like, going into Legion and BFA and all that, I did think it was going to be early on that Anduin finds out that he's not fit to be leader. I was actually expecting the Alliance to be starting to form their own league of, voices in regards to the Alliance's actions. But alas, that turned out to be the Horde. And Anduin had a very unusual sort of growth in Legion.
It's interesting to start at the beginning of kind of starting at where Varian's story ends and this new arc for Anduin begins, where Varian, I would say, has, I think, the best death in the franchise. I don't think it would be as good without the Legion cinematic, without that moment of him going directly to Anduin in the letter of, I believe in your ideals. I know that you are 100% right.
Anduin, I now believe, as you do, that peace is the noblest aspiration.
But passive ideals are not the only way to get there. There are things you do need to do.
But to preserve it, you must be willing to fight.
Which is a very good lesson. It is a very good kind of point on Anduin's naivete.
And it was Rathian's lesson. Also the ideas held by Rathian.
You would do well to learn some of your father's hardness.
He does want that sort of sense of peace, but you can't always be reactive. You can't be passive to it.
It is the ultimate message of Pandaria, too, of the idea that you have these ideals, and the question isn't, why are we fighting? It's the question is, what are we fighting for?
Then what are we fighting for?
What is worth picking yourself up and taking a stand? What is worth going to war for? Because ultimately, it's very easy to say, the ideal is peace and nice negotiations and talking things out. And that's obviously Anduin's ideal, because Anduin is the ideal.
What are you two working towards?
World peace.
Using a Mogu weapon forge whose powers you barely understand.
No great empire was ever built with kindness.
I'm not so sure about that. But I can tell you no great empire has ever stood the test of time by crushing its own citizens. The object is for both players to win.
But what Miss of Pandaria says is you can't just stick there and be sure of that. You can't be on your high horse with your ideals. You do have to actually fight for them.
And that's it. 100%. That is a good message. And like you said, that really resonates with Varian's death. Like you said, it's a good sort of death, and it sort of like compounds like Anduin's previous beliefs, and like you said, the message of Pandaria, essentially his contrast and foil with Rathian, taking a stand against people like Grosh. You'd think that this is a good, solid lead-in, wouldn't you? I feel like I'm descending into madness here.
It's one of those things where Varian's death is so perfect, not only because of how it perfectly ends his arc, but how it opens up so many others, of like the misinterpretation of the Horde leaving, of them thinking that was a betrayal. I think when you look at that moment, there's this very interesting moment of Varian knows it wasn't. He gets this very solemn look in the cinematic of, oh, this is hopeless.
She wouldn't.
I knew it! I knew we couldn't trust her!
Gen does it because Gen is Gen.
Me shaking my head. You know who needs a bigger ass whooping in World of Warcraft? Gen fucking Grey, man. Am I right? And especially so after the bloody reclamation of Gilneas.
My only critique of Varian's death is, where the hell was Jaina? She is standing literally right next to him seconds before the cinematic, and then she just pops out of existence. It's weird because like when you look at the Horde version, they go through so much effort to show, oh, like Thrall's fucking dying. Thrall literally gets blasted in the face by 3 Legion ships at once, and he's still standing.
Thrall coughing out like a cloud of green dust.
It's almost comedic how they do it, where it's literally like the encroaching Legion army, 3 ships come in, Thrall at the front, and they literally just start doing like pew-pew lasers at him, and he keeps doing this like thrusting animation back and forth because he keeps getting hit by the lasers, and then he falls over. But beyond those nitpicks... Oh no.
Sam? Uh-oh.
Well, we have a good easy point to pick up on after. That's a very easy point to pick up on again. That moment is very funny, and how the concept for that cinematic and that moment in the cinematic is very good. But it is very poorly executed in that it's supposed to be this big moment from the Horde side, like, oh, this massive Legion army is encroaching, everyone is dying. And you get this really solemn moment from Sylvanas, like, do I betray the Alliance? Do I leave them behind? Do I sound this horn of retreat? And we leave.
Do not let the Horde die this day.
And obviously she does make the choice, the Valkyr come down. And from the Horde side, it all looks logical. It all looks like the Valkyr come and save them, they retreat. But then you look at the Alliance side, and it's... You hear the horn, and these Dark Rangers just slowly step away from the edge, like they're intentionally abandoning them to die.
No, she wouldn't.
The worst retreat ever. It's one of those things where, like, you could tell that was one of their more... I don't want to say... Because obviously it's Legion, so it's been a few expansions, but it was still one of the kind of... They were getting used to doing large-scale action in their cinematics, and so to have that moment of these Dark Rangers just lightly doing an idle step backwards. And it's also this idea of, like, surely people know what a retreat horn sounds like. Like, surely if they hear a retreat sound up front, that would mean, hey, we need to retreat.
Right, like the Horde is in danger, something bad has happened.
Or like Sylvanas with her literal magic banshee voice could maybe shout down, we're retreating! And it's just, even from that, like, from that perspective, you don't see any of the Valkyr coming in, because, like, there's literally a Valkyr coming in and ferrying dying soldiers back off the battlefield. Surely they'd see that.
Hello,
Welcome back.
You're back. Welcome back.
The very end of Before the Storm is a very good moment to end on, because we ultimately get a very different Anduin in BFA than we do in that book, in a lot of ways. And that's a good kind of moment to kind of differentiate of the inconsistencies of where they view his ideals, which I can touch on once we're properly doing the discussion.
I'd say, actually, let's go into it now. Let's just quickly do a touch over in Legion, because I feel like Legion was a very volatile situation, as in, it was still, like you said, lots of potential. It was like, oh, hell yeah, setting up a Varian's compass, and, like, you know, the idea of, like, Anduin being inherently tied to the throne, but is he, though?
Like I said, Varian's death really worked in that it ended his arc very solidly, and it also set up a lot for Anduin, and that it set up really well just how shocking it was for him to be gone, even though it thematically ended him very well from a narrative standpoint. For us, in universe, it is treated as very sudden, very, oh, Anduin's king now, and he is clearly not ready for this. He is clearly not prepared, and they obviously show that in part because he's literally basically in shock in the intro quest after the Broken Shore, where he's just sitting there basically silent on the throne. He doesn't have an official moment to say anything about Varian's corpse right in front of him, or the tomb looking like his corpse, which is very morbid.
It's a good place to end the growth of Varian's relationship with Anduin, but you can still do a lot of work with that. And one of my requests, but one of my suggestions, like, for, like, later writing is obviously there are still things you can do with that. As much as, like, the writing team have been like, oh, I'm your father, Luke Skywalker, war in, like, glowing ghost variant, I do feel like, because Anduin does tend to be very emotionally constipated, he could have lingering resentment towards Varian. he could be angry that just as they were starting to develop the relationship for the better, Varian went and died. And that's one good thing that they could lie and say, well, Anduin's been covering it up for years, his emotions about like that. He's not expressed that at all because it's been rotting inside of him all this time, that even though he shouldn't be mad at his father dying, he is mad and he left the throne to him, and Anduin fucking hates being king. That's something they can easily sway into, as well as many other outcomes in regards to Varian's death. Or they could just cleanly cut it off there and say that, okay, Anduin's next troubles are coming king and he's not ready for that yet. You don't need to always entwine Varian into that.
Which I think they did an interesting balance of that, because obviously we got the comic before we got the lead up to the comic, which is interesting. We got the moment of him reading the letter, of him with Charlemagne, him being very like, okay, I am ready to do what I need to do next.
Son of the Wolf was very, very nice and clean cut for that. I read that comic, and like I said, I like that comic. It's very clear with its ideas. It's clear with how Anduin is at peace with some things, even though he's worried about the future, which is nice. It's like, okay, that's fair. I would be worried about becoming the leader now. Let's see how this goes.
It's one of those interesting things where, despite getting after, the thing that precedes it in the timeline is his quest line in 7.2 in Legion Fall, when we return to the Broken Shore, where even before we return to the Broken Shore, we find the compass, we bring the compass to Anduin, and that very much kind of sets off his little journey of kind of going through Stormwind. He's praying to the light in the cathedral and kind of not really finding things, which I find very interesting, because obviously in that moment he is expressing a lot of self-doubt. He is not able to call on the light because of that. And then from there, we see what is potentially the only moment of this, where he goes in disguise and he walks through Stormwind. And we see the citizens of Stormwind expressing doubt in Anduin as king. We see them basically going, he's a nice kid, he's got good ideals, but he's not Varian. And we don't know if he has what it takes to be king. We don't know if the person he is in line with that.
And that's in direct conflict to the stuff later that we get in Dragonflight, which is like, everyone misses Anduin. We just all want Anduin back, and he's the best ever. It's like, no, he fucking is.
It was this interesting moment of potential where he was being set up to prove himself as king. And you could tell that, at least prior to the shift in leadership internally, once Metzen left, they very much were planning that, because the thing they said basically when they announced it was, Anduin is going to be showing some of his darker sides in his pursuit of proving himself to the Alliance. It was this interesting idea where once he went through all the stuff in Legion, he proved himself to himself, I would say, of like, okay, I have the potential to be like my father, but he hadn't proved himself to anyone else. And that was kind of the interesting thing that sadly didn't really get used in BFA, but alas. It's this interesting moment with, after Varian's death, this is very much where we see the start of the Gen-Anduin relationship, and that father-son surrogacy, which I think started off fairly decently in Legion, because there was the moment in the cinematic where he actually gets to the Broken Shore, where he finds the sword, and Gen has that moment of kneeling down to him alongside Velen, and getting this kind of moment of, okay, the two things closest to mentors to Anduin, because at that time I would consider them both more mentors than father figures, giving him advice, giving him that wisdom, and Anduin ultimately using that to kind of find the light, find his connection to Varian. And it touches on this thing that I really like, that even as far as Shadowlands, which Shadowlands cuts it very close, but I do very much like that Anduin never gets a final word with Varian. He never gets that flat out, this is literally Varian right here saying, you're great, my son, you're worthy of being king, you're worthy of being whatever you want to be. Rock on. He never gets that. He always gets it through proxy. He has a letter from him in the event of his death.
Take this to my son.
He has a light vision that looks like him. He has some weird fragment spirit in his sword alongside Sarfang that we don't really know what that was, but that's a different thing.
My son. This blade does not belong to darkness. It was forged by valor.
And also by honor.
The fucking Jedi Force Ghost. Come on.
And then we get the interesting part of like these kind of, the thing I do like is him kind of latching on to surrogate parents as emulation for the father he lost with Gen. And my personal headcanon, it's not canon, but it's something I really like, is that in that moment in the 7.2 cinematic when he's talking to Varian in the light vision, I do believe that the person actually saying what Varian said was Gen. Because when it cuts away from the vision, the person in Varian's place is Gen, right in front of him.
What am I supposed to do now?
What a king must do.
And Anduin's just like, yeah, like projecting the idea of Varian onto Gen.
Because that moment introduces a very important line for Anduin and the future of his character, for better or worse, which is the line of, what a king must do.
What a king must do.
Which is a callback to the finale of Mists of Pandaria.
Father, what are you doing?
What a king must do.
Of Anduin needing to be willing to do what a king must do in order to move forward. And whether or not that means he needs to change himself to become king, or he is not willing to do what a king must do, is up for debate. You can take those very different interpretations, but in the end, that moment allows him to find his faith again, and he ignites Charlemagne not as Varian's sword, but as his own, empowered by the light. A very important moment after him having that self-doubt earlier and subsequently not being able to call on the light.
And we do have to worry about that. Secular stories once again with the war within.
Where he has Charlemagne and it does not have the light.
Yes, exactly. But we'll see whether the devs keep that in mind or not. Either way, yeah, I agree with all of those. Like I said, I actually think Legion was pretty decent in a sense of like everything that you brought up there. There was still enough like unsureties to the future of Anduin's character, I'd say there, that it would allow for that sort of growth in either way. And like you said, that's a very interesting point, like them saying that the darker paths that Anduin will take to prove himself. Anduin's never taken a darker path so far in any of the expansions.
Not even so much as been tempted to do so.
He has in the book in Shadows Rising.
Yes, true. Everyone listening, Anduin's okay with torture. Torture is okay.
But that's like the only moment, so.
Thank you, Madeline Rue. We all miss you and we wish you would come back.
Very much so.
If you're not listening to this,
yeah, she's totally listening to this very niche video recording of 3 random people talking about her story.
Well, hopefully we can just project our energy at her. She can feel some good vibes for the day. Okay, but yeah, this is the thing. I played through Legion a bit late because I had another moment where I was like, uni work's too heavy. I can't really play WoW. But coming into the end of Legion, I was like, okay, that's fine. I'm interested to see where this will go. And when someone said, BFA, Alliance and Horde at war, and I'm like, okay, willing to get that sort of like going, because the end of Legion was interesting, with like the wound and basically, like the ending of Anduin giving the hopeful speech in regards to that.
He knew that no one, not even a king, is more important than the Alliance.
Well, that does tie into kind of the hard cut end of Legion was the sword, and then draining the power, and then the kind of aftermath of that is everything with Azeroth and everything with what happens in Before the Storm, which involves that speech of, it all starts with basically one big Cold War metaphor.
What is this? We don't know. It would seem the Horde does.
Okay, let's see where we go from here. And I feel like this is the start of Anduin's sort of like, yes, BFA. Legion was showing small signs of it, although it kept it a little bit more obscure, I think.
It's one of those things where earlier we talked about the idea of the Horde acts and the Alliance reacts. And now we have more of that going to a moral center where the Horde acts in an evil way and the Alliance acts in a good way, where the act is not informed by the actual morality of it, but whether or not the Alliance is doing it. Because ultimately, the inciting incident of a lot of this stuff in this story is, okay, the Horde goes down and starts mining Azeroth. They want to figure out what it is. They want to figure out how to use it. And the inciting incident is Anduin orders SI7 to go down and kill a bunch of goblins and get Azerite.
We must find out more.
Agreed. We have eyes on it.
But the story never really comments on that, because even before the storm, it basically neglects that exists. It basically just does like a few chapters of gap of other story, and then Shaw just shows up with more Azerite, and don't ask how we got it. And then in the book, we subsequently get, oh, okay, we're doing that, now we're sending out the Explorers League to go look. And in the book, then we get a goblin counterattack. But it's not framed as a counterattack, it's framed as the goblins starting things. Because the goblins murder people, and they kidnap people. It's bad.
Goblins aren't the most charming people.
Before the storm, it was probably the start. I mean, like, this is what I mean about Legion 2 just having that sort of like inkling of this coming through. It's the reframing of Gen 2 through a lot of this as well that I really didn't like, because as much as I thought Gen was a great character, but he was a fucking dickhead, let me just say.
Well, what makes him good is that he was very much, he had his own character arc within the Alliance of finding unity with his old allies, finding unity where he used to just be a self-interested leader. And that was kind of the big plot of Wolfheart. That was a very good plot in Wolfheart alongside Varian. And now Varian is gone, and he's projecting not only all of his relationship to Varian, but his relationship to his son onto Anduin.
And people have argued, I've seen people argue that Gen is like, oh, cool with the Forsaken. He just doesn't like Sylvanas.
Which is an issue brought up in Before the Storm, unfortunately.
It's very much the softening of Gen, which is a very odd choice, because he made for a really good sort of aggressive leader towards the Horde, and easily could have been placed in that Alliance little shithead category. Like, he can't stop causing fuck-ups with the Horde, essentially, but genuine.
I mean, that's the thing. In Legion, he literally tries to assassinate the war chief of the Horde, gets their prize airship ruined and crashed into Stormheim, and when you get to the reaction of, okay, how does the Alliance react to him doing that? The most he gets is a slightly solemn glare from Anduin in Before the Storm.
I'm channeling Anduin here. Gen! Oh my god! Literally that. And the thing is, again, I really liked Gen when he was introduced in Black Cat, and like you said, Wolfheart really fucking, he's an interesting leader because of these sort of faults, and not just the comedy part of like King Fuck-Ups the Wolfman here, but like actually genuinely being that Alliance leader who was always teetering on the edge of Anduin just going fucking off his head at him like, Gen, what the fuck are you doing, you stupid fucker?
That's one of those interesting things where the idea of him doing that introduces this really interesting idea for Anduin of him not being a strong-willed enough leader to rein people in like that, in part because of his beliefs of people being able to do good, his beliefs of people being able to make up for their mistake.
Except for Rathian.
Oh, you deserve more than that.
For a particular reason.
But it introduces this idea that he isn't suited to be a king. He isn't suited to be a leader in this way. The leader of the Alliance, which is apparently hereditary, but that's a different issue.
Remember, Port, there's no homophobia in Azeroth. The idea of a hereditary monarchy is just there just because. Not to do with homophobia and needing heterosexual people whatsoever. Sorry, that's me going off on a tangent. No homophobia in Azeroth, yeah, sure.
This is one thing that I feel like they really dropped the ball on with Anduin, is that like regardless of whether or not he had that moment where he kind of feels empowered enough to kind of like step up and lead, he really should have had way more opposition from all sides of the Alliance. I think one thing that really intrigued me, like before BFA started, was this idea of this very young, idealistic king who just wants peace, stepping into this role where he would be surrounded by a bunch of warhawks. So like, you know, later Trallian, Gen,
Admiral Rogers,
right?
You could even argue like the Dwarven clans, with how much internal politics they have, they too are a little bit too aggressive, both amongst themselves and others.
Tyrande and the Night Elves, of course, who've been like fighting for way longer than he's even been alive. Like, that would have been a really good source of conflict for him. Like, it would have been really interesting to see how he would have reacted to not just opposition from the Horde, who he wants to make peace with, but getting that pushback internally from all these Warhawks and from his own people. You know, he's a peacemaker and a diplomat and a priest, and now he's the leader of this faction, and
that spans an entire
continent, right? Yeah.
So much responsibility.
Right. Whereas, like, in Legion, the conflicts would have been pretty clear cut, and they would have been working kind of with the Horde, like, okay, we gotta defeat the demons. But then, like, once that's over, it's kind of like the murkier territory of BFA. Like, that's kind of something that I feel like a promise that was never really followed up on.
Which is what was so promising about the idea of Before the Storm, of dealing with that idea of, okay, we just fought the easy, air quotes, conflict, the morally easy conflict with Legion. And now we're faced with this immense bit of power bringing from the planet itself all over the planet. How are we going to do that in a world where our tensions are still high because one side thinks the other betrayed them at the start of said big conflict? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the idea of figuring out what happened, figuring out how the Alliance reacts to this? And it's part of why I think so many people were expecting Lordaeron to happen first, because all of the cards were on the table for that. All of the cards were on the table for this idea of Anduin wants to prove himself as king. Okay, how does he best prove himself as Anduin? Or as good as Varian? He decides to be proactive. He decides to actually take action as High King, do something to appease the other leaders. What are the other most notable Warhawk leaders? People like Turallion, people like Gen, people like Sky Admiral Rogers, who all have a very common thread of hating Sylvanas and the Forsaken, who the whole faction now blames for the death of Varian. So how does he deal with that? How does he try and grapple with negotiations with Sylvanas? How does he grapple with, oh, Kalia's here now, the true heir to Lordaeron? Surely that's going to cause some issues in the Alliance because we have a sizable population of Lordaeronian humans in Stormwind. And Turallion, who is literally a Lordaeronian noble and the first paladin.
Yep, exactly. Like, it's not even just that. If you look at the like branching on effects, if I talk about dwarves for a second here, holy schmoly, Anduin has a clear bias towards Moira, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of dwarven clans are really fucking angry at the Dark-Eyed Dwarf still.
Despite, you know, Moira trying to murder him.
And the thing is that, like, there was not even anything brought up in, like, the priestly connections, like, you're favouring Moira because you're a priest, you know, and like the holy light is, you know, you're being too friendly towards Moira. And like there's no conflict between any of the leaders and Anduin. It's just everyone's immediately like, yes, sir, Anduin. How high do you want us to jump, Anduin?
Well, that literally is the issue in Before the Storm, is they bring up the slightest inklings of conflict. The idea of like, oh, Falstad going, maybe we should use this against the Horde. And Anduin immediately goes, no, and nobody brings it up again. Or Sky Admiral Rogers goes, maybe we shouldn't trust the Forsaken and do this gathering thing. And Anduin looks at her and just goes, no. And she doesn't have a single line of dialogue for the rest of the book.
Everyone who opposes Anduin post Pandaria, basically, is immediately shut down. Like you said, you can see this internal change of Anduin being questioned, at least just being questioned, to whatever Anduin says goes. Because he's inherently correct. It's like, what the fuck? No way would this amount of different people all agree for like this 19-year-old lad who's just become king. I'm so surprised there wasn't more assassination attempts like in game. Even if the devs were like, hey, how about if we do a quest about Anduin's assassination attempt? Lol. Like nothing like that.
Well, I mean, it's weird because they kind of do that, but with the Legion, it's like, we never really get motivation for it. It would have been so interesting to see, like, in the Rogue Order Hall. Obviously, it happens twice in the Rogue Order Hall, but the first time it happens, when we're with Garona, it would have been really interesting because the guy who ultimately does it, it's two groups. It is the Night's Watch from Duskwood, and it is the captain of the Stormwind Guard. Those are two people with very easy reasons to have grudges against Anduin and want to kill him. They're people who have very good reason to maybe want to join up with the Legion and get revenge on the Stormwind. But we don't actually ever see why they do this. They just kind of go evil because they're evil.
And I think that just compounds on the whole idea that Anduin is just right because he's the moral center. He can't ever be wrong because he believes in good. And again, that brings up the old adage of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. To expect Anduin to not be fucking up continually, being a very young person who's taken the mantle as king, is kind of ridiculous. Like, even if they're like, this is the thing, we wouldn't even be going on about this if the WoW writers hadn't cemented it in everyone's brains that no, this is deep. You're going to see conflicts. You're going to see moral choices here. You're going to see genocide. You're going to see war crimes. I'm like, okay, how about the repercussions of that? And we get crickets when it comes to Anduin. And it's like, okay, so why is it Anduin? Because you can argue that, oh, well, you know, he isn't the baby boy darling of the narrative because awful things happen to him and he feels sad. And still, again, just by this alone, like the implications of like the Forsaken meetup and stuff like that, reconnecting with their families and stuff. Really, Anduin didn't expect any sort of opposition or fuck-ups in regards to this. It's like immediately Anduin is relieved of all responsibility because he becomes so naive, right? That it's then twisted to be like, this ultimate naivety is ultimate good. Being totally naive of things is good.
That is ultimately one of the, I don't want to say messages, but implications in Before the Storm with his magical light bones of this idea that he quite literally has a built-in morality detector that tells him if he is doing something wrong, which literally makes him physically incapable of doing things wrong in his eyes.
And it'd be different if they tried to frame that differently as when Anduin is doubting himself, his bones hurt. That would have been more interesting.
Well, it's just one of those things where it shouldn't have been tied to the light at all. It should have just been he is disabled and his disability flares up at certain moments of emotional turmoil.
Perfectly put, Paul. When Anduin is specifically tormented by his own internal struggle, that's when his bones hurt. And people may say that's a bit on the nose, but for an MMO like this, that kind of works really well when it's just Anduin's internal struggle and he gets flare-ups because of his disability. That's cool. That's interesting because a lot of people can relate to that. You know, the stress and compounded like struggles of oneself can cause someone's disabilities to flare up. And it adds like this cool sort of fantasy element of it. That's fine. That no one's going to be insulted by that, reading that, or like engaging with that with the stories. It's quite a, you know, it's like, whoa, dude, he's just like me moment, you know, like that. Like when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling unhappy, that happens.
Or they could have added some moral ambiguity to it and have like every time his injury is triggered, that's the Naru kind of trying to influence him and his actions and how things are going on Azeroth.
It's weird because it's so easy to do that in the book because there quite literally is a Naru with the implication of that Naru manipulating Kalia. Because there's this moment right before they actually do the whole gathering between humans and Forsaken where he thinks, are my bones going to flare up? And because it becomes this thing where he is so used to it now that it's just, oh, let me check my morality detector. He doesn't feel it before then. And then subsequently, Kalia reveals herself because of her Naru visions when she has nightmares, and she basically, when she talks to the Naru about nightmares, she basically like, you'll have a moment when you know what to do and then the nightmares will be over. And in the gathering, Kalia has that moment. She reveals herself. Sylvanas subsequently sees Kalia, goes on her evil killing spree, kills Kalia, and then Kalia gets preserved and then resurrected as light undead, which is not going to go on that rant. But beyond that, one of the lines there is basically that the Naru says that Kalia's nightmares are over now. Kalia will not have her nightmares anymore. And it's basically this thing of, might not have been intentional, but it seems like the implication was that the Naru basically pushed her to her death in order to get a light undead.
Because undead don't sleep. They don't sleep, so they don't dream.
That too, I guess. I guess you can go on technicality.
Oh, we're going on a technicality here. Perfect. My lord, I know 100% they weren't considering that. But if they wanted to reframe it and recontextualize it and be like, yeah, sometimes the Naru, because I have a feeling with the upcoming War Within stuff, like obviously they're going to go down the Diablo route of being like, for every shadow, there's a light, and for every light, there's a shadow. Balance and everything.
They already do that. That's Illyria's whole thing with Turalian. She quite literally says in Legion, without light, there would be no shadow to her teacher.
If they do want to go on a Naru fall under that ambiguously evil category, which is a bit retrospectively changed to begin with.
We do already have Zira. She is kind of a big deal, so it's not like there isn't precedent. And it's one of those interesting moments where the Naru in the story, when we first meet her in game, she is a void being. She is a void god, and we purify her back into a Naru. And it's one of those things of, if we do eventually go into it, that will be very interesting, but will they remember that tie to Anduin's light stuff? And I think relevantly for perhaps the short story and War Within, since I think they're not likely to mention that stuff in game just because it's a lot harder to mention that in game, but I think a short story is a better place to mention his disabilities and how is he dealing with that now that he doesn't have the light.
That is the real question there, whether those 2 points will actually even connect in that short story. It'd be interesting to see how they do try and reconcile that, but whether they'll reconcile that again as like, these bones be your ultimate moral compass, Anduin, I think I'll fucking throw the book out the window. As I always say, all story ideas are good story ideas. It all depends on the execution. And whether they can encapsulate that, what was raised in Before the Storm, and actually provide a satisfying sort of discussion about Anduin's disability / bony moral compass here, will be another thing. I actually do feel like they're going to pretend that it never happened again, because they don't know how to reconcile it. I'm having a guess, I'm going to have a pretty good guess, it's going to be the Whispers, and the Whispers will be like, you can leave, people in trouble and no one will care, no one will know. And the light-infused bones will not be brought up again because people have pointed out how weird and bizarre it is when you don't treat it like just as a disability, and when Anduin is under a lot of stress, this happens. Or if you go full the opposite direction and play into the really fucked up idea that the Naru are trying to control Anduin and the light isn't good and he's going to have to go on an adventure to try and cleanse at least not his disability but the light from his bones, and then suffer whatever additional health deficits that has on him, is another question there, because that would actually be a very interesting story. But I think that the WoW writers wouldn't actually touch on that discussion about someone having disabilities in regards to a fantasy setting.
That really is one of the shames, is Anduin properly being disabled as a result of what happened with the bell was not only an interesting consequence, but an interesting way to actually have a disabled character come up in the story and see how a character grapples with that. Especially someone like Anduin, who is very much pressured to be more like his father. How does he do that not only when he doesn't have the ideals of his father, but if he doesn't have the physical capabilities of his father? When his calling is to be a priest, is to be pacifist, and also his calling the demand for what his father's calling is doesn't fit him.
It does make it incredibly interesting. But again, I feel like the WoW devs, they can handle it well in a very straightforward manner, and that is just being like, yes, Anduin is disabled, but he's strong in his own ways. Like every person with disabilities, you can't discount yourself because you need additional help with something. I mean, we all need help with something sometimes, and so far your journey's just been a little bit harder than others. Don't worry about it. That sort of approach to it. However, I do think they're going to take the Aragorn approach, if anything.
That ties into my next piece of critique before the storm, which is the concept of monarchy and the concept of leadership, and how very oddly things are portrayed in Before the Storm to be very, I don't even want to say implicitly, but explicitly pro-monarchy, in that it portrays Sylvanas, this leader that the Forsaken chose to follow her for what she did for them, as suddenly being, for lack of a better word, a fascist. She is entirely controlling of their society. She forces name changes on them to fit their cultural ideals. She literally confiscates and burns books about their history because she wants them to only think of the future, not about the past. And then contrast that to not only Anduin, where Anduin is shown as the good, nice king, everyone loves him, everyone's supportive of him, even the people who basically spit at his feet at the idea of doing the gathering, they still love Anduin. Even despite that, there's never a moment where anyone's like, screw you, dude. Not only is the issue with the ideas of monarchy Anduin, the other big issue is Kalia. And the idea in the book, there's a very interesting scene with Kalia and Anduin of the idea of like, oh, them directly talking about the idea of, you're here, you're the living heir for Lordaeron. Anduin, what will you do if people start calling for us to invade Lordaeron and get my kingdom back? I don't want that, but what will you do if I can't stop that ball rolling? and he doesn't really have an answer.
And it's sort of like, oh, didn't think that far ahead.
It does tie into the later stuff in the book where it very explicitly goes pro-monarchy, because during the gathering, people realize, oh, you're Kalia. We actually want you as queen and not Sylvanas. We want you to save us and bring us back to the Alliance, because it's actually the Forsaken that are oppressing us. The Forsaken are the ones that are causing the issues, and the Alliance will be the ones that let us live our lives freely. And so she chooses to reveal herself, and in her own monologue, calls Sylvanas a jealous queen.
Wow, I thought I was bitching.
It's a lot, and it's very much framed as like Kalia claiming her true throne, Kalia claiming her birthright as a very explicitly positive thing. And the only thing that is very like admonished about her is that she was too rash about it. She was too sudden about it. That she wasn't planning to do that all along, which she obviously wasn't. But that from there, he scolds her for her being rash. But that's pretty much it. Anduin of all people doing that. Very ironic.
There is definitely a pro-monarchy, and I think that also leads into the idea of the father relationships for Anduin too. I know that sounds a little bit strange, but the idea of the importance of blood family. And we see this many, many times in World of Warcraft, and I think that does lead into the monarchist sort of like standpoint here.
It's like, not only is like monarchy not bad as a concept in Warcraft, is it something that's kind of like revered, and Anduin is kind of revered especially as like a king.
My father was not the first king of Stormwind to die fighting the Burning Legion. My great-grandfather, King Barathan, and my grandfather, King Lane, also paid the ultimate sacrifice. The kings of my family have always fought shoulder to shield with their soldiers for the freedom of Stormwind.
Particularly in that one Shadowland cinematic where, for some reason, we go to the Archon, who her whole thing, the whole thing of Bastion is shedding off all of your burdens of life, shedding off all of the pride, all of the good, all of the bad. You lose who you're supposed to be to become a Kyrian, to become a part of their system. For some reason, we convince her to see Anduin through virtue of Anduin being a king.
My Archon, a living soul, seeks an audience.
A mortal?
A king. By all our measures, one who has spent his life striving for justice. One who would give anything to serve his people. One whose heart is true.
Very well. He may approach.
Like, it's obvious they were trying to do the whole, oh, Arthas parallels, this is like Arthas, it's a parallel to Arthas going to Lordaeron and revealing himself. But it doesn't really work when you're trying to convince someone whose whole thing is not liking those things. Like, convincing her about, like, oh, his humility, his selfishness, convincing him of his good traits would work there. But convincing him of all the things he is in life to have a parallel to Arthas while Uther is right there, it's obviously trying to be ironic there with the parallels to Arthas, but it's still presenting it as very, okay, no, people do revere this in the universe. People do see this as good, and it's shown as a virtue as to why that he gets there. Obviously, the trap comes later.
You will release this soul from your grasp.
No. He is bound to me.
Just as you once sought to bind your own brother.
But the trap doesn't go with the, oh, they were tricked into thinking this is good.
The over-focus on monarchy, and I do think at one time they were trying to posit Anduin to have a really like close like foil/mirror and antagonism with Arthas, and they realized how bad it wasn't working in Shadowlands.
Well, I just have one more thing to say about Kalia. With kind of the culmination of the weird reverence for monarchy is that her final scene almost props up the idea that she is worthy simply because she is a monarch, where she explicitly says, I have no leadership skills whatsoever. I was never trained to rule. My father never expected me to do that. I have nothing, but I'll learn. and then I'll be a good leader. Even though my first act is literally getting a bunch of people killed. It's one of those issues where it's the same with Anduin largely from this book onward, where he is treated as very above doubt, above questioning as king, simply because he is of the bloodline and because he is king. And nobody ever calls into question why he has this position. How good is he in this position? Do we want him in this position? It's merely accepted and loved because he is king, and that's that.
Terralion is popular with the nobles, and he's a natural leader to our soldiers. But the people of Stormwind miss their king.
Yeah, and I think that was compounded in the Human Heritage questline because Anduin is the chosen leader. It's, the will of the gods, what's the correct term for it? Divine right of kings. It's because it's the divine right of kings. He's meant to be here. Therefore, the people love him.
You'd think that being put into that position would be more of a corrupting force on Anduin, which is kind of what we see a little bit in Shadows Rising, which is why I think I like that book so much, is because you have this game world where you have these two diametrically opposed factions that have had all of these decades of bloodshed between them. It's a very brutal thing that's clearly not good for Azeroth. That was kind of the thesis of BFA, is that the faction war is bad for the planet, bad for the factions, bad for the people. War is bad. Okay, understand that. So you put Anduin into the position as a leader of one of those factions, and it's he's getting kind of sucked into this world where he's now in charge of the faction that's participating in this unhealthy dynamic, to put it very, very lightly. So it's kind of feels weird to have that war is bad theme and then be oh, well, war is good when Anduin leads it.
Stand as one for the Alliance!
You're doing all you can to stop her, Your Majesty.
When Anduin does war, it's good because Anduin is good.
It ties into a critique of certain other franchises that shall not be named, of where the idea that actions aren't bad because they're bad because they're done by bad people. And how the horrors of war aren't Anduin's fault, they're just the horrors of war, and he and the Alliance must suffer through them, whereas the horrors of war are very much the horror's fault. They're very much Sylvanas' fault.
Only innocents remain in the tree.
This is war.
No. This is hatred. Rage.
Burn it. Burn it!
And it's good you brought up Shadows Rising, because one monarch that is very much critiqued in her position as monarch is Talanji. Talanji faces a lot of critique, both in-game and in the book, towards her hereditary right. She is not just universally accepted by the Zandalari. People try and assassinate her because of her connection to Juan Samdi. They assassinate her because they do not think she will be good as ruler. They want someone else. And then again, in the book, people try and assassinate her for not doing enough in the wake of the battle for Jazara Lore. Her friend tries to assassinate her for it. And we very clearly see, even though we are supportive of Talanji as a character, and we're supportive of her trying to grapple with this system, the story does not present her as right because she is queen, or that her position of queen is right. It presents her as a person as right, and able to do good despite the valid critiques people have of her position.
They hate to see a girl boss winning.
It ties back to Before the Storm too, where in Before the Storm, Sylvanas is queen, but she is a horde queen. Therefore, she has the flaws of being queen. She has the flaws of her absolute authority put well on display. Very much on display, to the point of making stuff up retroactively to make her flawed. Thankfully, they saw some of the issues with that and amended them somewhat in the Sylvanas book, but the damage was largely done in Before the Storm.
For our side note that we may add to a bit later on in this conversation, we're going to talk about Anduin and his surrogate family members. People may say, what do you mean by that? It's the strange phenomena after Mr. Pandaria that Anduin simply does not have, discounting Bane just for this, he doesn't have any friends.
I only hope my friends will remember me as I was.
Anduin Anduin, though, however, when perceived by other characters in his life, is quite often used as a surrogate either son or brother or other family member. It's a repeated trend within WoW that Anduin is placed in familial roles with other characters, and other characters often project onto Anduin and they immediately see these family members. And due to that, Anduin is entering the war within with no friends. And all he has, once again, is familial figures, whether that's Gen or Jaina, or I'm guessing that Bolvar is still up and kicking somewhere, even though we haven't mentioned him for a bit, but even Sylvanas. And we're just going to critique this at the end. Anduin's bizarre relationship with always being placed in familial situations. When he has a male mentor, they become a father figure. If, in Sylvanas' case, Sylvanas' whole relation to Anduin, as revealed in the Sylvanas novel, is Anduin fills her brother role with Lirath. So, my guys, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess it's probably best to start with the good ones, I'd say, the ones that do work. I think the chief among that is Velen, because Velen, his is much more implication than it is anything actually in the text, especially considering when it was written. Velen didn't have a son in the story. That was written in Legion, but that was never a thing back in Cataclysm when their relationship started. Theirs was much more almost, I'd say, grandfatherly than specifically fatherly. He was very much this old mentor to Anduin. Anduin looked up to him. He found a solace in Velen that he couldn't in his father, but it didn't necessarily equate to being his father. And I think their relationship very much worked in terms of he found his faith through Velen, he found his purpose through Velen, and Velen, in turn, found a very perplexing source of visions.
The young king will become a great leader. I have foreseen it.
But he also found a lot of hope for the future, a lot of hope for the people of Azeroth, and that in turn very much informed his decision to stay on Azeroth.
I do feel like there's almost a greater source of comfort from, this sounds a bit like personally skewed, but I think because I never actually experienced this myself, it's very satisfying caring about like, almost a grandfatherly relationship, someone with great knowledge and great age being able to give some guidance. That's a nice feeling.
And also just a way that he was written very balanced and that he learned stuff from Anduin too. Velen's always been a very underrated favorite of mine in that, yes, he is quite old, and yes, he is very wise and wizened and sage advice thrown out everywhere, but he's never treated just as the old man who gives out sage advice. He is very much treated as someone who can learn in turn, someone who can make mistakes and learn from the younger people as much as the younger people learn from him.
It's an equally giving as much as receiving relationship, and that's always nice for your characters. Obviously you can have one-sided relationships with characters, but you definitely need to consider the impact in regards to that and the strain that may develop from characters in regards to that. Once again, it's all in regards to the context of this and how that relationship plays out. But Velen and Anduin, they mesh very well. Velen is a prime source of, he's a well of information about being a priest and his priestly duties and his priestly knowledge. One might even joke that he may be well travelled, Velen. He's experienced lots of things in life, therefore he is an essential part of what a younger person who is set out to lead would need. You need that introspection, so that always creates a really nice sort of equal balance between them, because Anduin provides Velen some, clearly positive, youthful effects on his outlook. I mean, we laugh, but interesting prophecies like that could be a point of a great interest for Velen.
I really like the Anduin Velen relationship as like a surrogate father, grandfatherly figure to him. I think that works really well.
Anduin refuses to eat or sleep. He ignores every plea to return to the palace. Nothing I say seems to offer comfort.
There's something like very comforting about he took Anduin in kind of after, we talked about this earlier, while that stuff was happening in Wolfheart, and kind of like sheltered him. I really wish that Velen had been more of a presence in Battle for Azeroth.
Yes, because he's very much like the only other voice of peace we really have, logically.
Yeah, either like as an advisor who was kind of on Anduin's side and in his court, or if Velen was absent because he was too busy dealing with the aftermath of Legion and taking time to mourn his son and things like that, that his absence would have been something that Anduin had.
Well, there's the big monkey's paw. If they had included him more, you just know they would have made it about his actual son and the actual father-son relationship, probably.
Right.
But if they would have tackled that with some nuance, that would have made a very interesting point. Would Anduin be able to help Velen with his mourning process, and could they have bonded over Velen losing his son as much as Anduin losing his father at roughly the same time? This is far more than Gen, who lost his son a considerable amount of time ago with Liam, because people always forget the time skip with the Worgen, essentially. But yeah, I mean, that all sort of like links together really well.
And him being part of BFA, I think one thing that I want to get into next time is Anduin's spirituality. Like him, Velen being around or being like a presence would have been a chance to kind of develop that side of Anduin as well, like his faith in the light, conversations about what that means, grappling with like the morality of some of the situations that he was dealing with. I think Velen could have been a good sounding board for that, to bring Anduin's priestliness more to the forefront than it usually is since for Azeroth when he became a paladin for some reason.
We don't mention the paladin nonsense here. And speaking on the flip side, I think one of the worst father figures for Anduin, Gen Greymane. However, I will say this with a caveat. I do think Gen would be an amazing foil for Anduin in a sense of like also being a king, but being so wrapped up in his own sense of revenge and his antagonistic attitude, and it would have conflicted very, very well with Anduin's sort of mindset. I mean, they're both hoping for the best for the Alliance, but in such different ways, and that could have been so interesting, so interesting. However, what has occurred is Gen's softening without any change to Anduin.
It's frustrating because I think it had a good start in Legion. It was a very mutual thing when it started, of as much as Gen saw Anduin as parallel for Liam, Anduin also saw Gen as parallel for Varian. And it was one of those like unhealthy codependent kind of things. And it kind of petered out with Anduin, where it didn't ultimately affect Anduin much at all, but it very much affected Gen.
And the devs really played into this sort of like a much greater impact on Gen, and like what should be an unhealthy relationship between them being played off as kind of like, no, this is okay, this is good.
Especially considering, you know, the whole idea of him wanting to pawn off his daughter to Anduin.
I mean, we're not going to go into the psychology of wanting to make your surrogate son your daughter's husband. I mean, we're going full Hamburg here. Full Hamburg. We're going all the way here. They could have handled it a much better way, in a sense of like having that antagonistic relationship that forces them to butt heads a lot more.
I think it would have worked really well if it was this idea that they were both almost trying to make the other into the family figure they wanted them to be, not who they are, where Gen very much wanted a son like Liam. Liam was, for all intents and purposes, the exact son Varian wanted. He was the take charge warrior leader who was willing to fight and die for their people. He was the perfect son. It's why it's such an interesting idea that he dies, because he was the perfect idea of a macho king to be. And so having this idea of them trying to push Anduin into being that when that's not what he is a very interesting concept, especially with all of the framing in that original Battle for Azeroth cinematic of him very much kind of being the devil on Anduin's shoulder.
Close ranks! Advance has won! Lordaeron will be ours! My king, we have her cornered.
As he approaches from behind him. And then likewise, you can have that stuff that we kind of did get with Anduin and Gen, where Anduin wanted Gen to be the father he wished Varian had always been, and wanted him to be the supportive parent Varian couldn't be anymore because Varian's gone. But that ultimately, Gen might have been too focused on vengeance.
I understand the need to mourn, but the king's place is on his throne. The broken shore must be our focus.
Too focused on wanting the kind of son Liam was to actually see Anduin for what he is and kind of have them butt heads over that, have them cause issues over that.
Visions don't win wars, Prophet. The boy has a good heart, but he's untested.
But ultimately, we kind of dropped Anduin actually thinking about Gen that way. And it was pretty much just from Gen's perspective.
And I feel like that was a totally missed point. And like I said, I mean, it could be for multiple different reasons why they're like, oh, we don't want Anduin to think as Gen is like a father figure, but it's certainly there. It's not only that, but like you said, it's that trying to fit Liam in, and then also it could have created such a particular dynamic for Shadowlands as well, with Liam's death at Sylvanas' hands, that it could have caused Gen to act in incredibly irrational ways, which we never got either. That's the thing, they really did just soften Gen down to be like, Anduin, no, you're being taken away by 2 harpies. Oh my god.
That is in part what makes things frustrating with Gen, because Gen, his conflict was also ultimately very tied with Sylvanas, and one of the reasons why his conflict worked, even up until Legion, was that he was in some ways irrational in what he was trying to do. In some ways, he was trying to get petty vengeance when it is not the time, where what he had to learn was to put the Alliance, to put his people over those things, and there were moments when he failed to do so and suffered the consequences of it. But that story no longer works when he is fully justified to do that against Sylvanas, because Sylvanas is the world's biggest supervillain and everyone hates her. And so going into BFA, the role of the person who hates Sylvanas the most very much got snatched from him and given to Tyrande. And so going into Shadowlands, he very much had to kind of lose that role entirely, because logically you would want to focus on Tyrande for that more. And all he really became is the concerned dad.
The best thing that any of us can do is to give Anduin the time he needs, and to be here for him whenever he comes home.
I actually still think that that was one of the probably the biggest fumbles. I don't think they should have made Tyrande that. I know the burning of Teldrassil and all that. It was a bad idea. I feel like the Gilneas issue would have been a much stronger narrative tie. I still will stand to this day that Gen himself has more chemistry with Sylvanas than Anduin ever did. And I will go to my grave saying that. And the thing is that's what makes the Anduin-Sylvanas connection so weak. It's because they really don't have any sort of past together. Their power dynamics are completely off kilter. Their goals are completely different. Sylvanas with this free will shit, and then like Anduin with these like, oh, peace at all costs, do not connect. They have personalities that have zero chemistry.
Well, I suppose that's a good way to segue into our next family surrogate, which is Sylvanas, and how I think it is especially frustrating in this part because it's very clearly something that is there throughout the in-game story, but it is never actually told to us in the in-game story. So we have this very weird parasocial one-sided relationship that we never actually get a resolution to within the game. And then in their final scene together, it's kind of just gone, and for the first time they're speaking like 2 people.
I need time to think about many things.
Anduin, I have faced who I was and accepted what I've done. Now, the work begins.
Yes, it does.
Which is very jarring.
Yeah, we'll touch on that final scene of Shadowlands too, because I know that Syl particularly hates it.
And it sickens me to think.
I had just one thing to say about Gen before we totally move on to Lirath. So I know that a lot of people really like the father-son relationship between Gen and Anduin, but I always thought that he would be better as like kind of an antagonist or just a character who had caused friction for him.
I understand the need to mourn, but the king's place is on his throne.
Especially as a warhawk, a kind of remnant of his father's time to kind of push against him.
The light is strong with Anduin. He will grow into his crown. We must have faith.
We need more than that, and so does he. Anduin wasn't there on the Broken Shore. He hasn't seen the sacrifice his soldiers made.
His pursuit for peace, or more peaceful solutions and more allegiances with the Horde. I think Gen should have been still against the Forsaken meeting up. I don't think he should have. I think it was a bad choice thematically to have him lose that ground with Anduin and kind of like come over to his side and be in his court.
The world is changing, Tess. And as much as I try, I find it hard to change with it.
I think Warcraft would be like a good like 20% better if more characters were allowed to like, if not hate Anduin, then to just like oppose him, especially on the Alliance side.
What is Gen's role going to be in the World Soul Saga other than Anduin's weird villain father? I really don't know. That's actually one of the things that made me really go, oh god, here we go. The other day when I was thinking about it, because Gen's like, no, I'm still going to be an advisor role for Anduin. I'm like, leave that boy alone. What is your problem? Go look at your daughter for a bit, my lord.
And why you took Anduin under your wing. But I have always been here. For you. Even if you've never noticed.
I know.
It was a little funny that the Gilneas reclamation questline was all about kind of rekindling or reforging that father-daughter relationship between Gen and Tess that's always been awkwardly absent throughout the Anduin and Gen stuff, only to have, at the end of it, Gen say he's making Tess queen so that he will be free to go down south again to Stormwind. Well, Anduin's gone, but to be in Stormwind, you know, ready for when Anduin comes home, presumably.
And to be here for him whenever he comes home.
It's like, I'm proud of you, daughter. Anyway, I'm going to my better child now. Bye.
Good luck. Have fun running the kingdom.
He really just did say, hey, I know I've been so torn up about Gilneas, but I'm really not that interested. I'm more interested in Anduin. Bye. It's a very, very odd relationship, and I feel like Gen would have always been better in an antagonistic role with Anduin, but you can see how that was essentially changing from BFA, and I don't know exactly why that would be when you have such a good character who can provide that sort of friction, at least within the Alliance, and whether Gen could definitely appeal to other nobles a lot better than Anduin.
If I'm putting on my tinfoil hat, I think the reason is because Gen is a favorite on the writing team and they just don't want to write him in that kind of antagonistic role, which is fair enough, I guess.
I wish I could take your pain away.
Only time will do that, my dear.
But
it's happening with too many Alliance characters. Too many Alliance characters.
With the Alliance as it is right now, is that there's not like enough friction on that faction, especially compared to the Horde. So it's just kind of like, oh, it's another person who will take care of Anduin and look out for his best interests and be on his side. And
I understand the need to mourn, but the king's place is on his throne.
The best thing that any of us can do is to give Anduin the time he needs.
No, we have too many of those. Too many.
Like with Turallion. We've talked about how Turallion was quite justified in his caution about Drakthir, for example, because back when Turallion was actually on Azeroth, dragons were up to no good, TM. However, Turallion has proven time and time again he's quite good at putting aside his differences and working together with people. He is quite the shining example of a paladin. Who knows whether whatever's coming up with Illyria may affect that, whether Anduin's going to be a home wrecker. No, the devs would never do that. That side port, that was almost pained. That was like, oh god, don't even mention it. Don't even speak it into existence. I know that a lot of people say he's a zealot. He really hasn't been so far. I feel like Gen 10 times more.
Not just a lot of people. The Drakthir shows up and goes, Turallion is a zealot.
That's all well and fun if you do want to like change his character into that. However, from like just the basis of what we've seen, Gen 10 times over would be better in that role. No doubt about it. He's old and set in his ways and he easily like small, grievances get in his way of like, his opinions about things. While Turallion is just a poor guy at the moment who's come from like a period of time. He's basically been stuck in time because he's been in, Argus. He's come back back to Azeroth and he's like, I'm a little bit distrustworthy of dragons for obvious reasons. My God, dragons? Really? We're all cool with that right now? Oh, I can understand people being like, okay, Terralion. But I can see almost a pivot from like making Gen to like being, oh, what about Terralion though? Yeah, what about Terralion?
Well, I do think there is some in a way that you can see because in BFA there were those scarlet pamphlets that were very, we hate the Worgen, we hate those abominations, but Gen hates the Forsaken more, so what if we use him and make him our useful tool to be an antagonist? And those are very much dropped now because the Scarlet are an easy baddie to unify with the Forsaken and be nice to them.
I will say whoever wrote those still has me in fucking tears about the thing of Sylvanas has got a human lover boy and it's Anduin. Never ceases to make me laugh. I'm always in tears because it's like, how fucking ridiculous is this, my guys? And it works a treat, may I just say. But yeah, they just dropped that.
I do think, like, in some ways, I think it is logical to pivot to Terralion there because if you're going to do a story about the Lorduranian Lightwielders, who better to try and manipulate than the Lorduranian Lightwielder who's been stuck out of time for 1,000 years?
Anyway, back to Anduin's like father figures here, and leading into Sylvanas with Lirath, another major character who is immediately not seeing Anduin for Anduin. And may I note once again, the only two characters who have clearly seen Anduin, well, probably three characters who have clearly seen Anduin for Anduin are Varian, of course, Velen, who treated Anduin as his own person, and Rathian, because Rathian noted that he was unlike other people, specifically. He was unlike Varian. And Rathian, while going, oh, you know, you're never going to be a good leader if you don't have, like, Varian's toughness in you, did not dismiss Anduin after that, which is the interesting part. He was chiding Anduin, but he wasn't dismissing Anduin. It was, again, one of Rathian's very hollow digs at Anduin. I'm going to imply this. I feel like a lot of Rathian's digs at Anduin were almost a type of longing. Now, not in a romantic sense, but I think Rathian, from that point of view in Mr. Pandaria, wanted to view things more like Anduin. And I think Anduin, in return, also wanted to be a little bit more tough like Rathian. However, they both saw each other for each other. And I think those are the three major characters who have all seen Anduin as Anduin, essentially. And where is Velen in the war with him? We'll wait and see. But either way, we're going to lead into now Sylvanas and viewing Anduin as Lirath, which I think is one of the weakest comparisons. And it really is a huge crack in Sylvanas' story because it is such a weak comparison. And once again, I feel that this continuous need to have Anduin viewed as a child figure for so many characters, again, for example, and like we said, an almost a child brotherly character for Sylvanas now. So, opinions on Sylvanas seeing Anduin as Lirath. What are your guys' thoughts?
I can let Syl go first to get her thoughts out.
I unfortunately don't have like anything very intelligent to say about this. I just don't like it. It's just weird to me. The thing that annoys me the most is I don't feel like we really got to see the antagonism between Sylvanas and Anduin developed fully in BFA.
Your father would be so proud. Is that his? You've gotten it all bloody.
You see it a little bit in the novels. Anduin saying that Sylvanas is like one of the very few, if not only, people who he thinks cannot be redeemed. Like they've gone too far, like past the point of reason.
Which is what makes a lot of this stuff in Shadowlands very weird, because he is very clearly back on the redemption train there.
It's the choice you never had. Despite all your grand designs, there's still some shred of your mortality haunting you. As if the Banshee Queen hasn't entirely eclipsed the Ranger General.
Yes, he is. He is. And that's like what I was leading up to, is that kind of goes away. It kind of comes back a bit in Shadows Rising.
It's very emblematic of the views of the authors at the time. Of the people writing the early BFA stuff were very on the dislike Sylvanas train, and I think the people in Shadowlands liked Sylvanas, but didn't really know how to fix her.
Yeah, that was a very difficult problem to fix.
Burn it!
So part of me is like annoyed that we did, like, I really thought that going into BFA, we were going to see Sylvanas push Anduin further and further, to push him more to more extremes, put him under pressure.
Bend his morals a bit.
Right, cause him to kind of act more in ways that he wouldn't normally.
What is this? We don't know. It would seem the Horde does, and we must find out more.
So that was something that I really wanted to see, and I don't feel like we got that. And then, so jumping into Shadowlands, where she starts to feel all this empathy for him and like protective over him.
Anduin, must you bear that weight? Farewell, little lion.
That's like even more of what I did not want to see.
It's this very illogical question that everyone had, I think, at the start of Shadowlands of why now? Why of all the lines to not cross is Anduin the one you're choosing?
I've not come this far to falter now.
Then why do you hesitate?
And ultimately, the answer to that is because she sees Anduin like her brother. And that is the big answer, but the issue is that that's never consciously done for her until the very end. There's never actually this reason like, why is she doing this? And there's never really a reason she can give to the jailer that feels convincing. The jailer doesn't seem like the kind of person that would tolerate that, especially given how ultimately kind of superfluous Sylvanas is to his plans at this point. There's no... Obviously, this ties into the larger issues of the jailer being a bad character. Surprise.
Oh shit, really? Really? Mr. Naked Nipple Man is not a great character.
Death was never meant to be changed.
Who would have guessed? I'm going to tell a little bit of the truth here. As much as I'd played WoW back to front, when we were heading into Shadowlands and said, well, you know, Sylvanas' brother, Lirath, I did a double take and I was like, what?
That's good reason, because as far as I know, Lirath has come up a total of 3 times before this novel. One of them is in the Three Sisters comic, which, art aside, quite well written, quite good characterization there, quite good relationship to Lirath and implication there. And then I believe once or twice in Varisa's books, which is not really about Sylvanas at all, and not really about him being dead. It's just, oh, they have a brother.
I'd never read, I had the actual comic book, but I'd got it for Anduin's story. And I never really read in depth on the Three Sisters one. And I got round to it at the end of BFA and they said, her brother. And I'm like, I thought she had 2 sisters. Which one was the brother? I was confused. I didn't know about Lirath. And that is really symptomatic of WoW's writing as a general thing. And again, this like almost a heavy reliant need on, okay, we need a way to connect these characters. How can we do it? And Blood Family always pops up. And a lot of the times it does not hit because this was not set up in any sort of reasonable kind of way. Like we said, we didn't even know Velen had a fucking son before Legion. Like who? What?
It is one of those big things with WoW, where WoW very much tends to go with the idea of, I think they're trying to do found family stuff in a way, but I think they're not really realizing that found family is not relationship to literal family. And so the idea of people having found family stuff, of like, with Sylvanas, it very much feels like in the wake of them excising her from the Forsaken, they needed to very much find a core for her character, and the core they settled on was this idea of no matter what she goes through, she's always a Windrunner. And that's kind of her big thing, is it's her blood family that matters to her most in the end, not the Forsaken. And through that, they kind of use that for Anduin. And like on the surface, I can understand what they were doing with Sylvanas there. Like she wasn't conscious of it because she was just rationalizing it to herself. She was rationalizing, oh, if I can convince him of my ideology, then we'll have a willing participant. And that was a really interesting idea of like, oh, we're doing the Arthas parallels. We're doing the idea of, could Anduin be convinced of our cause and be convinced that all of these dark deeds are worth something? And on surface in game, you can see these ideas of weird jump cut between the start and end of their conversations aside. The idea of simply just Sylvanas tried to appeal to that.
You know, these endless lectures of yours
have failed to convince you.
She failed. She was forced to make the tough choice of, do I dominate him or not?
Make your choice, Sylvanas Windrunner.
And ultimately, she did make the choice, which she then clearly regretted.
3 keys remain. Then they will see.
What you don't realize through the game stuff is the reason why it failed is because the conversation immediately prior to that was Anduin basically going, it was never about the ideology at all. You just see me as Lirath, and that's why you're doing this. And so you can very clearly tell this thing of like, okay, a lot of stuff clearly happened in between these two cinematics, but they never tell you what. They never tell you why their dynamic changes so much. So then when you get to that final cinematic at the end of Shadowlands, they have such a different dynamic for a reason the game just doesn't explain.
Farewell, Sylvanas Windrunner. Until our paths cross again.
Farewell, little lion.
And even then, that final cinematic, and I'll hold true to this, I don't think it doesn't hit even slightly. It's such a garbled mess.
I have more positive feelings on it, but I'll save that for our later Shadowlands section. The stuff with Sylvanas in the book stretches back a lot to, in part, the idea that Anduin's presence for these characters, be it Sylvanas, be it Gen, almost takes away their agency in terms of having relationships. Because rather than existing and having chemistry with a character, they don't have chemistry with Anduin. They don't develop a relationship with Anduin. They develop a relationship with the surrogate they're projecting onto Anduin. And that's why ultimately the resolution to Gen's surrogate relationship to Anduin does not involve Anduin. We get that final admittance with Tess, and Anduin is not there at all because it's not about Anduin.
I see you, Father. Always hiding from your pain. It's why you built that wall in the first place. And why you took Anduin under your wing. But I have always been here. For you. Even if you've never noticed.
I know. And I'm sorry.
But who knows how he's going to rekindle that in the War Within, Paul? Or the last tie-in, we're going to rekindle that really unhealthy father-son relationship. And also, digging into all of this, because this is the point that I really wanted to bring up, but really cutting to the bone. Many people listening to this may ask, okay, so why does Anduin have so many daddies / siblings or / things like that?
Anduin.
Anduin.
Anduin refuses to eat or sleep.
The best thing that any of us can do is to give Anduin the time he needs.
And also my honor.
And it breaks down to a couple of points. It, again, breaks down to the WoW writers' almost, I don't want to say obsession, but their very strong fondness towards the importance of blood family.
They're very protective of him, and that kind of shows up, I think.
They're very funny about blood family. Blood family, despite everything, is still seen as the ultimate form of expression and dedication. We see that with the Black... Ironically enough, with the Black Dragonfly. I mean, those characters treat each other like shit for most of the patch, but it's still considered they must immediately resolve their differences because they are family. Very much an Apex, Caligos's Blue Dragonfly issues. They're family, most important. The Windrunners, they're family. It's most important. Gen's family, it's family, the most important. Anduin and Varian, it's family, it's most important. Varian and Esau, it's family, it's most important. It's continuous. It's never someone that a character that may have acted as their mentor or their friend. And it's even compounded with the Drakthir, ironically enough. Like dragons made in test tubes. They're still creatures, the people that we're born with and stuff like that, which essentially you would, even though in this case it's a rather nebulous idea of they're blood related. Who knows how the Drakthir work, to be quite genuinely honest. so many plots in WoW depend entirely on the importance of blood relationships. Jaina's story in BFA, Talanji's story in BFA. It's a constant thing. It's never someone really in the main story of WoW, like a main focus in any of WoW stories. Is it someone, the only one that I can think of, top of my head, like straight up, like, okay, that is one that's, okay, that is a little bit of a difference, is Uther and Arthas. That is the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, Illidan and Malfurion, like, these are all blood family. It never ends. We never have someone who are either past lovers, we never have someone who are friends, we never have someone who, like, rarely have someone who is a mentor figure.
And we almost had past lovers with Delisra and had the first boss of Eternal Palace be her former lesbian lover, and then they kept that.
We can only hope, Port. God, that would have been so fucking tasty, man, to say. Even with that, with the Night Elves, you can just play it off as, well, we were all in the court together. Still, it doesn't have that same passion as the devs seem to pour into blood family stories. So
it's like Sylvanas didn't care about Anduin's situation until, or his like situation. It was only in comparing him to her little brother that she was able to kind of find empathy for him, when it really feels like she should have done that anyways, because she should have been like diametrically opposed to mind controlling.
Each time he dominates my will, I feel myself slipping further away. Is this what you felt when Arthas raised you, Sylvanas?
That's the thing that's so frustrating, is in Shadowlands, they do so much parallel between Anduin and Lirath, or Anduin and Arthas, when I really think the one time a foil would have worked was Anduin being dominated to Sylvanas being dominated. Of what if instead of becoming a pseudo-Arthas in that armor, he became more like his Hearthstone undead art, where he becomes more like a Banshee, because ultimately the parallel there is not making him like Arthas, it is making him like Sylvanas.
But I'm going to put in a posit there. You guys are totally right. However, it's feminizing Anduin, and they don't want to do that. Now, we're breaking it down to the core point, which leads me into the next bit. They can't take any actions that feminize male characters. And that sounds a bit weird, and it also leads into the need for family members rather than friendships for male characters. It's a level of feminization, as in, they don't want to make Anduin seem gay. They don't. And it's a rough point, and I know the devs would be like, no, that isn't true.
It might not be a conscious thing, but it is definitely a subconscious thing.
And it's the fearfulness of making Anduin too feminine. It's the fearfulness of making Anduin too close to a male figure without that familial blood relationship. This is what they did in the War Crimes book. Rathian specifically refers to Anduin as his brother, as brothers.
Well, I think that also does tie into looking forward, and the one last familial relationship that isn't quite confirmed, but I do think will be incredibly likely based on the short stories, which is Thrall and Anduin.
You needed time. We stayed away.
The best thing that any of us can do is to give Anduin the time he needs.
Because the short story description is basically Thrall learning to love and let go of his son, which immediately leads into his role in the cinematic with Anduin.
The world needs your light again. My son.
And I do very much expect we're going to see more of that. Thrall views Anduin as similar to his son Dirac, especially considering the very heavy parallels between Thrall and Varian, and the very heavy parallels within the idea of letting a son go on their own path with those father-son relationships. It's one of those moments where I guess I will end it on a positive note of, I do think they could use this repeat plot thing to their advantage for once, by maybe having it be presented as Thrall being flawed for doing that, and presenting Anduin as hitting a breaking point where he was very clearly in the book a little bit frustrated when he realized what Sylvanas was doing, that Sylvanas was projecting so hard, and he tried to manipulate that to get himself free with her. Obviously didn't work. I think he probably should have some issues with everyone seeing that as him, especially in the wake of the last time, leading to his domination, leading to all of this stuff happening to him. So if it happens again, it would be a very good moment to have him show some flaws, have him explode on someone, have him tell someone, shut the fuck up. Stop treating me like someone else. I am me.
I'm not that person anymore.
Exactly. We're dying for that moment with Anduin. We want him to have that spine to finally go, I'm sick and tired of this. It's the removal of Anduin's passion, and it's the removal of Anduin's ability to act, like his agency. And as much as you guys don't like hearing this word, probably buy it from me by now, it's the desexing of Anduin. He isn't allowed to feel passion or love or like anything towards people. He always has to have a familial relationship which has its limits. This is the thing, there's nothing wrong with familial relationships. I'm harping on about it. But the thing is that when it's repeated so many times like this, I think everyone can actually relate to that. Feeling babied in your life by someone.
You're doing all you can to stop her, Your Majesty.
You know, someone in almost a parental figure to yourself, and you're like, please stop with this thing, because they're projecting either so hard onto you or they're treating you like a child. And Anduin now has had that repeatedly, that people see him as a child or see him as a son and things like that. In a way, it removes Anduin's agency in his relationships to characters, because he can never have like a mentor without it being familial. He can never have a friend without it being a brother, but in not a friendly brother kind of way. And I suppose this arches into Anduin's overall wants and desires for himself. He doesn't really have any. Not anymore. He doesn't long for anything. He has no passion for anything other than peace. It's always peace this, peace that.
Which in some ways you can kind of maybe make that intentional, make that the idea that he's been under so much pressure as king, he hasn't had time to even stop and think about that anymore. But I do think that ties maybe a little bit too much into going into BFA, because the idea of BFA and his agency and his infantilization is a much longer topic. So I do wonder if that might be a good place to stop this for now.
We're going to hop into that topic soon enough. And I think that's what frustrates me a lot about Anduin's character. You see his passion in Mr. Pandaria. He's enthused to do things, and he may be foolish on some things, but he's excited to do things, and he wants to do things, and that passion is there. He wants to know people. In a way, he does want to make friends. You see him with Rathian, in like teasing Rathian.
But no, I think that's a good place to end before we get to the much more complicated topics of BFA and Shadowlands, and touch on things like Anduin's faith, like his loss of faith, like his loss of agency, a lot of that, because as much as we can talk about it in context of the family surrogacy, it's a much more widespread issue in his narrative, not only in terms of him losing his agency, but him causing others to lose agency. So I think that's probably a good place to end for now and leave on a good cliffhanger of the dreaded BFA topic for next time.
Yes, and Shadowlands.
Just a nightmare. I'm bracing myself for whatever the short story has. In my little wizened heart, I do have a lot of optimism. I hope that the devs do not let me down. All right, Paul. Okay, no need to flex on us with the disco ball.
That's awesome.
Let me just say, brilliant points, everyone. And that sort of covers our first part of all of our little conversations here. We could say a lot more.
And we will say a lot more.
You will be.
Don't you worry about that. So, thank you for everyone who tuned in and listened. And thank you guys too. Thank you, Syl. Thank you, Port.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, no worries there. I really like listening to your guys' input in regards to this. And I really do like Anduin as a character. He suffers with obviously his major issues, especially in the last two expansions, but we do hope for the best for him.
We might have spent the last 2 or 3 hours ranting about our critiques of Anduin, but as the Mr. Pandaria section showed, we do in fact like him.
We do, yes.
In our next conversation, the first thing that we need to do is record an hour about what we really like about Anduin, and just even from like design, his, you know, his possible growth that he can have. I think a really good one, Port, would be talking about like the queer coding on Anduin too, whether that's intentional or not, but it's so powerful. It's such an overriding force in his character narrative. And I know that some people will be like, no, but it really is like so strong. And the idea of like not fulfilling like a father's expectations, but forging your own path, and then those things linked in with that as well. Such a fucking tasty topic, may I just say. Anyway, thank you so much. Also, you guys, it's time for bed. Fuck you. Yeah. See how you like it. See how you like it. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Hey everyone, it's Sylvanas. So I am sitting down to try and record a tangent or two to stick into the end of the first Anduin Roundtable discussion that I've been having with Sam and Portergauge. So I had a little more to say about the relationship between Anduin, Sylvanas, and Lirath, but to start, I'm going to have to go on a little tangent. So I'm a fan of Rathian's character, and one thing that I've noticed over the years is that fans in even World of Warcraft, the text, i.e. the books and the game, tends to place emphasis on Rathian being a danger to Anduin or some kind of threat. A recent case of this is in the Exploring Azeroth Eastern Kingdoms book, where in Rathian's entry, which is written by Matthias Shaw, he places particular emphasis on the fact that Rathian once knocked Anduin out, hit him in the head. This happened at the end of War Crimes. Rathian knocked Anduin out to try and prevent him from getting involved in the big fight that was about to occur with Garrosh and the Bronze Dragon and time magic. So that kind of stood out to me because even though the Eastern Kingdoms book talks about other entities and organizations and people who would logically be also a threat to Anduin, like Vanessa Van Cleef and the Defias Brotherhood, which are the anti-monarchist characters in Westfall. Vanessa is not called out as being a threat to Anduin nor the Defias Brotherhood, nor anything else that's covered in the Eastern Kingdoms book. It's just Rathian. This is probably partially why I get a little defensive when I encounter people who are exaggerating Rathian's negative traits, is that I'm used to being on the defensive about him so often because this is usually what people bring up when they come after the Rathian Anduin ship, is that Rathian is not only not fit to be in a relationship with Anduin, but he's actually dangerous to Anduin, even though people usually celebrate Anduin punching Rathian in the face. It's kind of like mixed messages on like how dangerous Rathian is or isn't to Anduin.
Oh, you deserve more than that.
That's the background that I'm bringing into this. Is I'm used to people being very defensive of Anduin and wanting to protect him from threats to his person or his emotions.
My father is dead because of...
So Sylvanas Windrunner has objectively done way worse things to Anduin in canon than Rathian has. Sylvanas has kidnapped Anduin, tortured him, put him through the worst that the Maw has to offer. And the Maw is basically Warcraft's version of hell. So a lot of torture. And ultimately, she took away his free will and turned him into a slave of the jailer via domination magic, which is exactly what Arthas did to her.
You mean he will compel me to defend him? Each time he dominates my will, I feel myself slipping further away. My friends, the ones I almost killed, they believe my hands are clean, but they don't feel clean.
So there's that. And I tend not to see people bring this up. Like, no one ever brings up the harm that Sylvanas has personally done to Anduin, at least not as much as people bring up the harm that Rathian has done to Anduin, which is objectively much less. So coupled with that is it's just very odd to me that the story took a turn to where Sylvanas not only empathizes with Anduin, but subconsciously thinks of him as she does her little brother, whom she was incredibly fond of and protective of. It's just frustrating to me to see the story's willingness to allow Sylvanas Windrunner to grow and change after causing events like the burning of Teldrassil, the slaughter of so many soldiers and civilians during Battle for Azeroth, doing all of these horrible things. Burn it! And still seeing value in her as a character and potential for not quite redemption, but seeing her capacity for good, and furthermore, not seeing her as a quote-unquote threat to Anduin. She gets a nice little moment with Anduin at the end of Shadowlands where Anduin kind of confides in her about his turmoil, his PTSD after his domination by the jailer.
If I've no trust in myself, how can I expect my kingdom to trust me? To put their faith in me when mine has faltered?
Must you bear that weight?
There's also the moment where Anduin almost speaks up in defense of Sylvanas at her quote-unquote trial, where she's standing before the Arbiter and Tyrande is passing judgment on her.
Are there any gathered here who object to this fate?
And I don't think we're ever going to see anything even close to that kind of reconciliation, that kind of like meeting of minds between Anduin and Rathian.
Anduin, I have faced who I was and accepted what I've done. Now, the work begins.
Yes, it does. Farewell, Sylvanas Windrunner. Until our paths cross again.
Farewell, little lion.
Because, we can't encourage the shipping. So there's that. It's just, I guess I'm not in the mood for a brotherly or paternal relationship between Sylvanas and Anduin.
Farewell, little lion.
When the story and the fan base are so against him having similar reconciliation or amicable feelings with Rathian. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is I noticed something that was so subtle, I almost missed it with the comparison between Anduin and Lirath. So Lirath is set up as a tragedy. The core of his character is that he was the light of the Windrunner family. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't inclined towards war or violence. He was something that was meant to provide joy. He was an artist. He was a musician. How he contributed to the world was through art and music and his calming presence. So Lirath ultimately was something to be protected. He was not meant to be a protector. And his story ends in tragedy. Late in life, he tries to become a warrior like his sisters. He is tutored in private by Valera, and there was an attack by the Horde on the Windrunner village, which he threw himself into because he was skilled enough to where he could handle more or less a blade, but not skilled enough to know when he was outmatched in a fight. And this is a tragedy. So Anduin's character has been taking this weird path where he's a priest. He's technically still a priest, and he technically still wants peace.
Only one of us wanted this war.
But he is expected to be a warrior like his father. That is how he is meant to lead and be king.
What am I supposed to do now?
What a king must do.
And And the story frames this as not Anduin forcing himself into a role in which he is not suited for, but Anduin becoming a man and taking up his father's sword. And learning how, well, not just learning, he's been being taught how to fight. This has been presented from as early as Cataclysm, when he was given sword lessons by the dwarves. This has been something that's been in the cards for him for a while. And I find it a little disappointing that the moral of Anduin's story, or the theme that Warcraft seems to be going with, is that even gentle characters whose calling may be something else must learn how to fight brutally or be brutal in this war-torn world. That was Anduin's lesson in Legion explicitly, where his father in his last letter to him tells him something to the effect of, your pursuit of peace is noble, but you must learn how to fight.
Anduin, I now believe, as you do, that peace is the noblest aspiration. But to preserve it, you must be willing to fight.
So tying this back to Lirath, that is the tragedy of Lirath's story, is that in trying to shelter Lirath, he never learned how to fight. And that was the reason why he died and why he is no longer around to play his music or give the world his art, is because he did not learn how to fight. And it was actually harmful that the Windrunner family sheltered him in a way by not teaching him how to fight. And I guess this is more of like a personal opinion. I just don't really like that story. I don't really like that theme, because I don't feel like people should have to fight in like a hand-to-hand combat way to be useful in the World of Warcraft. What intrigued me about Anduin was this story about a young man who was a priest and who was a diplomat who could find solutions to problems other than fighting. I feel like that was done really well in MoP, where Anduin tries to fight, he jumps into combat, and he is absolutely, literally crushed in trying to do so. I think that's all I wanted to say, is that I find that subtle echo of Anduin's story in Lirath's story interesting, and not in necessarily a good, interesting, in kind of a, oh, this is just more fuel for the fire that is Anduin must learn to be a man and fight, which is the direction that his story has been taking. I really wish that World of Warcraft would meet Anduin in the middle more, that he doesn't have to be this macho, manly man, and see him more as a priest and a diplomat and less as a warrior like his father. I think that would be a more powerful story if he was able to affect Azeroth in ways other than with his sword and being a leader and leading an army into battle. I feel like he, as a character, can be so much more than that. And I feel like this theme of him needing to pick up a sword, or gentlemen needing to still learn to wield a sword and to fight in a physical way, to be a little detrimental. And World of Warcraft has the potential to tell a story with Anduin that's can amount to so much more than that and be so much more complex and nuanced than just gentlemen should still know how to fight.